Oops. Okay, so mine. Okay. Sorry, yeah. Okay, mine is here. Copy?
See, well, it's the same title, but then it says
Okay.
This one.
This one?
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Copy, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's already on the laptop? Okay.
I did it this morning.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Wait.
Austin held you. Okay, perfect. Just to note that it is here. In the trash. Oh, what I did, okay. Okay.
Hello, can I ask everybody to take your seats, please? We will start in a minute. Can I ask everybody to please take your seats? We just want to start sharply. Okay. I think good afternoon, everybody. It's me again. Hello. So we are starting our final fourth session of the conference entitled Socializing Health and Healing. We have a keynote lecture followed by 2 presentations in this first part of the session. And we are, of course, starting with our keynote speaker, Dr. Ann Austin from University of Missouri St. Louis. And she will talk about health making in the past, a social model of health disparities in ancient Egypt. There you go, Ann.
Thank you. Okay, I have the challenge of second day after lunch. So I might clap my hands every once in a while just to keep sure everyone's awake. But I'm actually going to start by contextualizing why I think this conference is particularly important, and why the research that I'm hearing from yesterday and today I see really collating into attacking some of the myths that we have around that history of health that we're trying to understand in ancient Egypt. So this lecture is based on my book, and it opens with a question that as I was doing research for the book, asked many friends, colleagues, and students. And I would ask them to just give me their kind of brief description, 30 seconds, of the history of human health. What has that looked like? How has it changed in the last 3,000 years? And when I got their responses, what I noticed is there was a trend, probably not what the trend this room would have, but a trend in popular perceptions of what health has looked like in the past all the way up until today. They basically argue that health is something that we can only control in modern times, that fighting disease and being able to control our health is a modern phenomenon. And I have an example of this. A German pharmacologist, Gustav Born, said, quote, "It is surely no accident that natural science germinated only twice in human history, for the first time in Athenian Greece, where it did not survive, and for the second time in post-Reformation Europe, where it did." So this argument that like health essentially is a product of both Greek and then European Enlightenment, and that's where medicine originates from. And you see this myth in a lot of the medical histories that are written really to be the history of medicine for the world. So for instance, Vivian Newton wrote Ancient Medicine, and she said, "In Greek medicine are to be found the beginnings of Western science and medicine in its gradual emancipation from religious and folk healing. Observation and argument replace prayer and panaceas." Or Roy Porter, who's written multiple volumes on the history of medicine, said doctors were no longer pretending to be an intercessor with the gods, and instead the true doctor would be the wise and trusty bedside friend of the sick. These examples carry with them this kind of connotation that other past people were responding to illnesses with treatments that were neither rational nor effective, that they were false and untrustworthy caretakers. And when other medical traditions were rooted in religion, by that logic, they would have made meaningful, or according to this argument, they would not have made meaningful impacts in the history of human health. This myth then continues, arguing that with the advent of biomedicine, particularly in Europe, marked the beginning of reason-based approaches that markedly improved human health. And through understanding health as the presence of disease, key medical advances were suddenly possible. Bacterial infections could now be treated with penicillin, cancerous cells with chemotherapy, and dangerous viruses with more harmless vaccines. The myth ends with the idea that we now live in a world where any health problem can be solved through this next big discovery in biomedicine. Harari, in his very popular book Homo Deus, said, "In the arms race between doctors and germs, doctors run faster. The era when humankind stood helpless before natural epidemics is probably over." Published in 2017. Now, I think we all can now, in reflection, see that this is in fact not the case. We can quickly unravel this myth with the emergence of COVID-19, which made it clear that pandemics are still a concern of the present, killing over 3 million people in 2020 alone. As Harari predicted, researchers quickly developed effective vaccines, yet many people did not have access to them, while others who had access might have hesitated or refused to get them. Clearly, biomedicine alone cannot save us from disease. The COVID-19 pandemic also helped us see that our health is a consequence of more than access to medicine. Its economic fallout helped us see how small daily decisions that people made impacted their health and the health of their loved ones. Things like whether to wear a mask, how to support a friend who lost a job, what to do when childcare is suddenly unavailable, whether or if you're able to work from home or isolate, and many more choices affected who was able to survive and not the COVID pandemic. In the last 2 decades, public health researchers have become increasingly aware of how social context impacts health. The World Health Organization assembled a commission on the social determinants of health in 2005. The results came out in 2008, and their data are astonishing and reveal how much where you are born dictates your health outcomes. For example, a child born in Japan has a chance of living 43 years longer than a child born in Sierra Leone. And this difference is not only accounted for by infrastructure or ecological differences between countries, but is even visible within the same country's social structures. So for example, here we can see under 5 mortality rates are invariably higher among the poorest households, but there's this clear connection between health and wealth as they step up, or rather step down to the richest households. So instead of this disparity where we would assume the poorest have this under 5 mortality and then everyone else with access would have a very different bar, we see that these bars change with every 20th percentile. This idea of a kind of gradual change in health, some have argued, is simply a modern phenomenon. And they point to some of the ways that our health is impacted by our social context. This slide is an example of research done in the United States, where researchers have estimated that 40% of our health inequities are explained by our socioeconomic factors alone. When you look at that and compare that to the other points of comparison on this chart, things like healthcare only account for half of those socioeconomic factors. So often when we talk about the history of health, we really focus it on medicine and disease very specifically. But here we can see that in some ways, medicine is a very small factor in our overall health outcomes. So if these social determinants of health are so important in modern populations, how might we leverage them to understand health patterns in the past? And how might this offer a way to dispel this myth that I just described about the history of health and medicine by giving more agency to past people over their health outcomes? These are the questions that drove me to write my book, Health Making in Ancient Egypt, which will be the focus of today's talk. This study combines my osteological observations on human remains at the site of Deir el-Medina. I've had the privilege to be the lead bioarchaeologist for the IFAO mission at Deir el-Medina since 2013, directed by Cédric Larcher, who's here today. And I'm very excited that I get to present this work here at IFAO. This is the first time I've had the chance to present my work with an IFAO mission, actually here at the headquarters. Now, my study combines the health patterns I see in human remains with the site's extensive texts. So I use this combination to understand how people are responding to the illnesses and health disparities that I see evidenced in the human remains. And I'm pulling data from over 1,000 individual elements across multiple tombs at the site, as well as over 200 texts coming from a wide variety of genres, including bureaucratic documents, personal letters, and medical texts as well. My goal in this talk is to, in my limited time, showcase a few examples from the book and use those to expose what I argue are translatable principles that identify how society impacted health in the past. And the important part about this is that when we often talk about Deir el-Medina, we couch it in saying this is a unique site, this is an individual site. We don't know if Deir el-Medina works anywhere else. And my argument here is that we have things we can take from this work and apply elsewhere, and I'll give you a few examples at the end of the talk and challenge you to see if you can identify ones outside of the talk. So we've already had a lot of introduction to the ways we study disease in the skeleton. And so I'm very grateful to the previous presenters because they've done the hard work for me. As we've discussed, when looking at health in the body bioarchaeologically, we can look for individual diseases, but often that's a very difficult task. Few diseases leave characteristic and diagnostic lesions in the skeleton, and even when they do, it may only be a small percentage of the people who had that disease. So instead, we have different markers which today we've been exposed to already, like cribrorbitalia and enamel hypoplasias, and these, as we've seen, are really kind of generic. They're non-specific markers. And while in many cases that's a disadvantage, in my study, this is an advantage because I'm interested in comparing overall health regardless of which diseases people experienced. And these markers represent that kind of overall stress experience. So whether somebody was stressed because of malnutrition, because of child abuse, because of exposure to malaria, all of those are going to similarly impact the body in certain ways. What's also convenient for us is that some of these stress markers occur at different periods in the life phase and represent an individual's survival from an earlier stress experience. So in the book, I identify and compare patterns of health across 6 different markers in the skeleton. And today I'm going to outline a couple examples, especially from childhood, to give us a sense of this question of whether and how health and wealth were connected in ancient Egypt, to really exhibit the fact that if there is a connection between health and wealth, that suggests that they are actually actively doing something to promote and improve health. And we'll start with these enamel hypoplasias, which you've already been exposed to. Just as a reminder, these develop in childhood as the enamel on your teeth is growing. So they represent that earliest childhood interval up to around age 7. They're often linear, but here's also an example where you can find pitting and grooving. And as previous research has shown, we can sometimes use these to identify very specific times during childhood when individuals experienced health interruptions. Now here's data from across the Nile Valley, from across periods of history. And I want to point out a couple things in this slide. First, if you look for Deir el-Medina, you'll see that this site has some of the lowest rates of enamel hypoplasias that we see in the Nile Valley. So whether we're comparing per individual or per canine, you can see Deir el-Medina is showing up at the really far lower end of this graph. We can also see that there does seem to be a health gradient similar to the graph of under 5 mortality I showed earlier, where we have kind of gradual differences over a variety of sites. And when we look within sites, which is a much better comparison, we can see that there's differences based on socioeconomic status within sites. So when we compare, for instance, the Giza high officials to Giza workers, you can see there's a big jump in enamel hypoplasias, telling us that there's a correlation between health and wealth. We see the same kind of thing happen as well at Amarna when we look at the North Tomb, South Tomb cemeteries in comparison to the North Cliffs Cemetery, where you see a big drop-off in enamel hypoplasias. Cribrorbitalia, which was mentioned earlier, also represents health interruptions, usually in childhood. It tends to develop slightly later based off of the rates of change in red marrow in the skull. And cribrorbitalia, there's data from many different sites, so I don't want you to read this slide. I don't think it's possible, but what I want to point out is where that gray bar is. That is where Deir el-Medina lies. So somewhere in that top 4th or so of Egyptian and Nubian published data. But what's also really interesting about cribrorbitalia is that we can compare, because we have so much data, how it may or may not correlate to a variety of variables. Nicole Smith Guzman has gathered and published data of cribrorbitalia across a very wide variety of sites. And this is just one example of how I've grouped these data to show how we can compare them. If I look and compare it by oases versus sites in Nubia, Upper Egypt, or Lower Egypt, look at how much variation there are in these bars. Look at how little correlation there seems to be based on site location. Similarly, Smith-Guzman compared them by latitude. Does that give us useful information? The answer is no. She compared it by socioeconomic status. Does that give us useful information? The answer is no. In fact, she compared it by the people who are doing the studies, in case this is differences just based on the bioarchaeologist that's recording these data. The answer is no. So when we look at these patterns here, we see that, in fact, wealth and health do not seem to be correlated. They are not connected. And as we've seen earlier, the possible connection between Cribba orbitalia and malaria might be driving some of these numbers. So one point I will make is that at a global scale, when we look at where the Nile Valley falls, all of these rates are much higher than most other areas of the world. So it's probably being driven by some of our local environmental factors. I bring this up to point out that when we talk about health from a bioarchaeological perspective, it's very important that we break down each of these ways that we're measuring health to compare them separately to see when and how they might connect to social behaviors. The last one I wanted to show, to just showcase what we're learning bioarchaeologically, is looking at stature. And so gives us more of a reflection of what's happening during adolescence. If you have health interruptions in adolescence, you won't achieve the genetic potential stature that you could have had. And one way we can measure that is through maximum femur length, which is what I have here. And there's a couple of things that are important about this. One is we look for how those averages fall. They might be more reflective of genetics than anything. So those averages give us some information, but they aren't always as useful as looking at variation. If we find individuals that are way below the average in a standard population, that suggests that their health was so poor, it stunted their growth. And we have very few examples of stunting at Darul Medina. We can also look at and compare overall rates of this variation in stature to get a sense of whether or not we're seeing any kind of swings in health across a group or population. This gives some data from multiple sites. It gives a sense of some of what we were just seeing before with our enamel hypoplasias. For instance, elite individuals like the Giza High officials or the New Kingdom kings have some of the highest statures that we have recorded averages for, versus our Giza workers fall much below that. But I really want to focus in on this point of variation, because if we look at this example, this is a chart showing standard error for females versus males, just to give a sense of variation, and this is based on global data. And what's fascinating for me is that Darul Medina has incredibly low values across both of these categories of male and female at a global scale. So that's going to tell me two things. It's telling me there's a lot of genetic comparability at the site. We have a pretty tight community, but also that they're not experiencing a lot of variation in their health, at least by that adolescent phase. When I put these together, and we look at what's going on at health patterns across ancient Egyptian sites, what I want to point out in this slide is really, where is Darul Medina falling? I'd expect it to fall somewhere between other working sites, because the men in this village still have to do incredibly hard labor despite all of the opportunities they get, and these elites. So I'd expect it to be somewhere in the middle. And when you look at this chart, I've just got a rank scale where anything to the left represents better health outcomes, anything to the right represents worse health outcomes. And Amarna and Giza, in fact, do fall into these ranges of worse health outcomes when compared to our Giza elite, when compared to the site of Tombos, which is more of a kind of middle-class bureaucratic population. But Darul Medina, especially when we look at childhood health, is falling far to the left. So what might be happening to explain why children and adolescents seem to be faring incredibly well at Darul Medina, potentially better than some of these more elite sites? To that, I'm going to turn to these social determinants of health. So my book looks at multiple of these. There's different ways that we could categorize them. Today, I'm just going to have time to talk about one, and I want to focus on social and community context, because I actually heard multiple things that came up yesterday and today that speak to how your social support network affects your health outcomes. So when I say social support, what I really mean is this provisioning of assistance or comfort to others, typically to help them cope with biological, psychological, and social stressors. And academic research on social support looks at it both in terms of its structure. So what are the social structures in place? How does one's social embeddedness connect to health outcomes? As well as functionality. What are the things that people are getting? Is it information? Is it emotional support? Is it tangible things like food or other kinds of economic assistance? And looking at how those may or may not have a direct impact on health and stress. The short answer is they have a direct impact. Even when people just anticipate social support, their stress hormones go down. So social support is something that, even when it's not offered, can have some kind of benefits to it. Related to this is this idea of social cohesion, which describes a sense of connectedness and solidarity within a group. One way it's more clearly defined is, quote, the absence of latent social conflict, whether in the form of income or wealth inequality, racial or ethnic tensions, disparities in political participation or other forms of polarization, and two, that presence of strong social bonds measured by levels of trust and norms of reciprocity. So this gives us some solid, tangible things that we can look for at Darul Medina. Do we find those norms of reciprocity? Do we find some similarity in income levels, et cetera, that create that sense of social cohesion? And when we look at the impacts on health, we find lots of examples of how social support would buffer stress. So for example, making sure people have access to food in times of need. They could create conditions to prevent encountering stressors at all, or this direct benefit regardless of whether stressors are present. So this is that direct benefit of the anticipation of social support regardless of whether it's been given. So what's the evidence we get? And this is where, for me, the importance of the work we're doing here and the importance of why this conference works since it's 2-day symposium is that we need to bridge what we can learn from bioarchaeology with what we can learn from Egyptology to see how these two sides really speak to each other. And in order for me to see and understand social support at Darul Medina, I first have to define what are the terms I'm looking for that I suggest indicate an emic concept of support. And so there's two different kind of terms for care that I'll mention today. And the first is this idiomatic expression you shall pay attention to, radiyam khair, which uses the hieroglyph of khair, which is the face, as a literal representation of the gaze and thus attention of a person. So, for example, in one text, a woman named Werner writes a letter to the scribe, Nefer, and she separately pleads for both him and his sibling to pay attention to their brother and to not abandon him, to abandon. So in the context of this example, the verb pay attention to, radiyam khair, is intentionally opposed by this verb kha'a, which is to throw away or to abandon. That's the verb that's used when we talk about divorce. And this pairing of attention and neglect suggests a norm of regular caretaking, that like there's no in between, right? You're doing one, paying attention to, or the other, neglecting. And so these pleading requests of Werner illustrate the broader expectation of siblings to be attentive to each other. The second term used at Darul Medina for caring for others is nui, and it's often describing caretaking as provisioning. So, for example, it can suggest supplying provisions, as in O Prague 1826, in which a woman writes to her sister about an argument she had with her husband. The woman explains that they're having a quarrel, and her husband, Mary Ma'at, continually threatens to throw her out, to abandon her. She tells her sister that he yells at her daily, saying, even though you have siblings, so this is the bottom part of the text, even though you have siblings, they don't take care of you. So he says, yelling at me daily. Now look, this is what you have done to me ever since I resided here, while everyone is bringing bread, beer, and fish daily to their people. So in this case, nuri, to take care, literally means to provision, to give food every day to your people. There are a variety of texts that talk about this kind of reciprocation. Things like providing food, providing drink, providing clothing, providing medicine, and dozens of these texts, when mapped to see who is giving care to whom, demonstrate that much of this is very cyclical. We don't see, for example, an abundance of texts of men taking care of women or vice versa, of parents taking care of children or vice versa. There is an expectation that these things are done in both directions, whether it's for siblings, across generations, even between a workman and his boss. Residents of the village also did several strategic things to ensure their family members could provide that social support when needed. And so here's an example of a family appeal in Austrian Berlin 11247, in which a father writes to his son, saying, "Do not turn your back on me. I am not well. Do not stop weeping for me, because I am in darkness. My lord Amun has turned his back against me. You shall bring for me some honey for my eyes, and likewise ochre that is freshly molded, and galena, real-back eye paint." And then there's some breaks, and it says, "Am I not your father? I am damaged and searching for my sight, but it is gone." In Oberlin, this example where the father appeals based on this relationship, "Am I not your father?" shows again the expectation among family members, and in this case, how that expectation even appeals beyond what the gods have decided. So being abandoned by Amun, he should not yet still be abandoned by his son. One of the most famous examples from the site of securing social support is Will of Naunakti. Now, this is a will from a woman in the village who is relatively wealthy in comparison to most other individuals, having inherited multiple generations of accumulated wealth. She was solely in control of property from both her father and her first husband, the scribe Kenner Chobshev, who would have also inherited from his adopted father, the scribe Ramoza. So she's inherited wealth from some of the wealthiest individuals in the village. Furthermore, she was in control of 1/3 of the property shared with her second husband, with whom she had at least 8 children. So in her will, Naunakti divides up this property unevenly among her children, cutting several out entirely. She justifies this decision by saying, "As for me, I am a free woman of the land of Pharaoh. I brought up these 8 servants of yours and gave them an outfit of everything such as usually made for those in their station. But see, I'm grown old, and see, they are not looking after me in my turn. Whoever of them has aided me, to him I will give of my property, but he who has not given to me, to him I will not give of my property." To which she then completely eliminates 3 children from her property, and in fact, one of them, Neferhotep, actually protests this. He brings it to court to say that he should still receive some of her property. The court refuses him and actually says that if you ever do this again, you'll receive 100 lashes. This will demonstrates 2 ways in which Naunakti used the legal system to secure social support for and from her family. When she disinherits several of her children, she indicates it's because they were not reciprocating that expected care in her old age. Arlette David describes this as the retributive principle, a legal principle found more commonly in wills and other legal texts, which demonstrates that this concept of reciprocal care was a widely held belief that carried with it legal weight. Second, she makes her statement in front of 14 witnesses. This is an unusually high number, which includes some of the most senior members of the community. By publicly calling out those members of the family who were negligent, and by rewarding those who took care of her, Naunakti uses her notable position in the community to coerce her children into providing social support. Pressure also came from neighbors and other members of the community to provide social support, as evidenced in OP 311, one of several ostraca that Frederick Hagen has collated as the prohibitions, instructional texts warning what not to do in order to live a good life. The prohibitions are unattested outside of Deir el-Medina. They may have even been composed by the villagers themselves, so they represent a very local idea of what are our social norms. In them, they say you should not ignore your neighbors on the day of their need, and then they will surround you in your moment. You should not celebrate your festival without your neighbors, and they will surround you mourning on the day of burial. They reference the broader action of reciprocal gift-giving at Deir el-Medina, which is further evidenced by a small corpus of texts that list specific goods given by members of the community. These lists were not necessarily public, nor official. They don't include witnesses and rarely offer more information about the event except for its date. They sometimes include information about the occasion in question, indicating that members in the community all gave at the same time for events related to drinking, which both men and women attended. The objects listed in these texts most frequently include small quantities of food, such as very low loaves of bread. However, the number of people who give is usually quite large, making the total quantity of food enormous. So, for example, in Ostragon DM 222, at least 28 people bring food items with well over 60 loaves of bread, along with many other foods, all given for the same occasion on the same day. What each individual gives can vary considerably. There are examples where a guest brings just one loaf or cake, whereas another guest might bring 30 different types of food. And the quantity an individual brings does not seem to be entirely linked to either status or kinship, since scribes are sometimes documented bringing the lowest quantities of food, and siblings could bring vastly different quantities as well. The combined traits of these texts suggest that they served as aide-mémoire, possibly for the person hosting the event, who would need to remember and reciprocate with similar quantities or types of food at a future party. While these texts don't suggest community gift-giving in times of illness, they do point to the broader communal responsibility toward reciprocal social support. They demonstrate the need to remember who exactly gave what in anticipation of future reciprocity. Moreover, they demonstrate the broader intertwined social networks of some of the people at Dar el Medina, where parties tangibly create and reify those social connections. These parties also just show the sheer force of communal contributions toward social support and may have been an important reminder of reinforcing these networks during transitional and stressful moments of a household like childbirth, marriage, coming of age, or death. Overall, these various documents point to the forms and strategies of social support widely held at Dar el Medina. They demonstrate that the villagers actively promoted their health by ensuring social support from their community through caretaking, through provisioning, through giving property, and they also strategically ensured social support in the future by emphasizing community norms, reciprocity, and using the legal system. The nature of the community at Dar el Medina enabled it to have high levels of social cohesion because of the web of interrelationships within the community, including the presence of many extended families that married into each other, lived near each other, and worked side by side. Furthermore, the community's clear physical and social boundaries defined its membership, and the state support for the villagers meant that many social conflicts could be avoided. Parties and feasts emphasized that importance of reciprocity and made public the value and quantity of social ties individuals had, as recorded in their gift-giving texts. They suggest several clearer translatable principles we can use to reconsider the social impacts of health in the past. First, as you can see, these trends are happening at the community level. So when we're looking at health at Dar el Medina, the overall trends of less health impacts in early childhood and adolescence are reflected at that community level, and the reasons for that are based on that communal social support. So it's important that we understand trends within communities to evaluate the potential avenues for social support or its limitations, as we saw with Creba Orbitalia. Second, the emphasis of reciprocation and provisioning is an opportunity for us to understand whether and how those principles exist outside of the site. Where else do we find norms of reciprocity and provisioning, and when are those norms also transgressed? And third, what happens when social support is limited? So Dar el Medina has an incredibly high amount of social cohesion for the reasons I just provided, but that's because by the time many of those texts were written in the later 19th dynasty, there was already generations of people living at the site as well established. So what happens in shorter term contexts where people are divorced from their family, are taken out of places where that social support might naturally exist? For that, I'd like to turn beyond Dar el Medina as just a few examples to kind of percolate, get some interest going, and give you the opportunity to evaluate how you might see this operating in other sites. So as already established, people recruited for short-term state projects at sites like Giza and some of the cemeteries at Amarna, had worse health experiences than we see for most Egyptians documented elsewhere. And this forces us to ask and reconsider how social support might have varied in these kinds of short-term sites. In such context, something like social support is far more difficult to secure without intergenerational wealth and large families. This text documents those who were part of the mining expeditions at Wadi al-Hudi. And when thinking about social support, we could look across the text to think about how that might have varied given the numbers of people that were serving in this very short-term project. So for example, would there have been more social support among the 1,000 able-bodied men coming from Thebes in comparison to the far fewer 100 men coming from Komombo? Another text from Wadi al-Hudi speaks to how norms of reciprocity and provisioning might have responded to some of the more severe needs this population faced without adequate expectations for family and community care. This inscription speaks to the expectation to give water to, quote, every thirsty man, and here the expectation comes from the elite and the need to provide to anyone. So there's not the kind of boundary that Mary Ma'at describes of how you give beer to your people rather than the people, right? This is to any person. This speaks to one way that norms of reciprocity might extend beyond the community at a more remote location like at Wadi al-Hudi. Additionally, this last example speaks to a norm for the elite to offer social support to those that they feel held to. Now, this is the fragmentary text P. Berlin 3049, which when originally translated by Pascal Venus, was described as a public health decree from Thutmose III. Gilden's revised translation of this text lessens some of its emphasis on public health by reinterpreting some of the ambiguous terms in the text, but when read with social support in mind, the text still retains a sense of its importance for public health. In the decree, Thutmose III asks those among the wealthier classes to satisfy the gods by protecting their people. And it specifically cites that such protection is necessary to drive out disease, and doing so will appease the gods and remove the afflictions individuals faced. Moving beyond just thinking about that reciprocity, also thinking about how is social support being supplemented at more remote sites. This is a photo of Sarbet al-Khadim, which Gabriele Conte, our organizer, looked at the medical titles that are attested here, and the upcoming volume being Well in Ancient Egypt. And he did this in order to understand where Egyptian healers operated, and therefore who would have access to them. In this site, laborers mined turquoise and copper in Middle Kingdom expeditions, and Conte's research identifies at least 10 titled individuals who served as the Kereb Serket, or the Za'u Serket, or also the Shed al-Khawut. These are individuals who are either controllers or removers, in this last example, removers of scorpions. Similar titles, such as the Kereb Serket, are documented at Dar al-Medina and are healing professionals in these communities. And yet again, we're looking at a population who likely had little social support embedded within their groups due to the short-term nature of the mining expeditions. And so such groups have limitations for the breadth of their social support. Yet simultaneously, just as seen in the previous examples, the state has offered some access to medical professionals to make up for some of those differences. And Taha actually presented these data earlier today. We see the same thing even happening when we look at, for example, at fractures at sites like Giza. So even though we don't have the full comparable data just for texts of medical professionals at the site, when we look at Giza workers, we see very well-aligned fractures. This is a fracture from Dar al-Medina, but just to give you a sense that if a fracture is well-aligned, you're much more likely to have a better healing outcome. And at Giza, among the workers, we actually have higher, technically, rates of well-aligned fractures than what we would see in many elite populations and many other populations. So the alignment rates are around 89 or 90%. This is most likely due to the fact that they were working with doctors who are very well acquainted with fractures at the site and were able to offer that kind of outcome. So here's a direct example of how offering access to medical professionals would actually improve health outcomes. These are just a few examples, but they illustrate the power and the potential to examine how the ancient Egyptians were, as I call them, health makers. They used their social and communal support and their norms to improve their health. As you can see, by considering society's impacts on ancient Egyptian health patterns more directly, we can also dispel this myth of the history of human health as simply a modern biomedical phenomenon which grew out of rational Greek medicine, and instead replace it with something that is much more informed through both bioarchaeology and Egyptology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. It was really good, really interesting, and something that I think globally we're coming to really more appreciate the social support and its importance in actually the whole healing process. So we're kind of making a full circle back to it. Brilliant. Are there any questions for Anne? Yes, please.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I'm a kind of fascinated or searching a lot about Deir el-Medina. You mentioned concerning social support. Subtitle number 3, giving proprieties. What do you mean with proprieties in Deir el-Medina? Providing or giving proprieties?
Oh, yes.
What do you mean with proprieties? Yeah.
Yeah, meaning giving food, medical care, so other kinds of provisions, meaning food, care, shelter. We've got great examples of people getting divorced. When we say divorce, we just mean living separately, and how your ex-father-in-law would have to house you. So the idea that you are getting those support that you need in those moments of transition. Does that? Oh, whether the tomb, that's a great question. They're family tombs, so in that sense, access to the tomb is very important and very limited, and there's lots of moments where that access is an issue. So it is an important point if you can or cannot access or use the tomb, 100%, yeah. And be buried within, being able to be buried at Deir el-Medina on its own, especially for some families where the people who are in the community are forced to leave because they're no longer members of the workforce.
Thank you so much, Anne. This is wonderful, and I love where you are taking it, the examples that you gave us for ways of taking this approach and applying it more broadly. Really, really love them. This is just a small thing about the will of Nana.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the circumstances of that particular one, particularly this idea of her gathering all of the most important people of the community to witness this, and whether it's really mostly about the social cohesion and the sort of peer pressure, shall we say, in the community more widely, rather than coercing her own children. It's about coercing her own children, yes. For any ambiguity, she is coercing her own children. Well, I mean, the only thing I feel is that this kind of outs them for for transgressing that social expectation of providing support, and I wonder whether it's kind of a burning the bridge situation for her and them, but then for the wider community, it reinforces the consequences of not doing this for your own parents.
I think it's doing both. And so this was found, there's other documents that go along with this. One is the eldest son that's actually offering the most support. There's also a text that shows the additional things that agreements that they're making, basically, so that he concretizes that support. And in this text, when she writes out the children, there's one daughter that she writes out that she actually doesn't write out. So in that case, there's actually no fiscal consequence for that daughter, but there is a very visible legal way that she's being called out. So I think it doesn't necessarily, Neferhotep doesn't seem to change his mind. He doesn't take care of her later. But it definitely seems to be coercive in nature, in my opinion.
Yeah, she sounds scary.
She's a badass. I mean, I wouldn't want to mess with her for sure, yeah.
Any more questions? No? Okay,
Great.
we just want to keep to schedule. So if you
Perfect.
come up with a very good question for Anne, please do grab her during break, which
Sounds
will be
great.
after the next two speakers. So let's thank Anne for her wonderful lecture. Our next speaker is Sophie Schutt from Julius Maximilians Universität Würzburg with a presentation on written medicine, oral remedies, professional and popular healing practices in New Kingdom Egypt.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone involved in the organization of this wonderful conference, and of course, especially Gabriele. I know how much work it is, so well done. And I think my talk probably follows quite well from the one you just heard, because it also touches on kind of access to healthcare and to social support. But so I want to focus on written versus oral medical knowledge and how we might try to gain a more kind of holistic understanding of healthcare practices in ancient Egypt. So the premise of this study is that the medical texts recorded in the New Kingdom reflect the intellectual production of a well-educated elite, as indicated, one, by the content of the texts, and two, by the very fact that they were written down, seeing as only a very small portion of the ancient Egyptian population was literate. And so this circumstance really begs the question, how representative of ancient Egyptian healing practices are the medical texts? Meaning, if the texts were produced by a learned elite, do they reflect the therapeutic practices of all Egyptians or only of the privileged few? And if the medical texts are representative only of a socioeconomic elite, is it then possible to access information about the healthcare practices of the rest of society? So my talk today really centers on these questions, and I just want to note that it's still quite preliminary. So the question of the medical text's representativeness not only relates to socioeconomics, but also to different, we might call them domains of healthcare. So in the field of medical anthropology, the term medical pluralism is used to describe the availability of different approaches, treatments, and institutions that people use to maintain health or treat illness. And this can really range from self-treatment and family care to kind of traditional medicine and modern biomedicine. And in an ancient Egyptian context, we can also speak of medical pluralism, where different actors are actively involved in healthcare, ranging from lay people to what we might call professional practitioners. And so the question is then whether the medical texts reflect only one domain of healthcare among several, or whether the texts represent kind of an amalgam of different healthcare domains. And in an attempt to understand this kind of pluralistic therapeutic landscape in New Kingdom Egypt, I use three analytical concepts from medical anthropology to describe different kind of medical traditions or systems, we might call them. And these concepts are adopted from Arthur Kleinman's work on healthcare in the United States and Taiwan back in the 1970s. And he constructed this tripartite division of healthcare consisting of the popular, the professional, and the folk sectors. And he identified the popular sector as encompassing individual, family, and community activities, arguing that the vast majority of illness episodes are managed within this sector. So here we have to do with kind of non-specialist responses to malady. The professional sector comprises organized, formally recognized healers whose practice is institutionalized, standardized, and typically regulated somehow, while the folk sector includes non-bureaucratic and non-institutionalized healers who are recognized for particular therapeutic skills. And so in a modern Western context, this differentiation between the professional and the folk sector kind of translates into a differentiation between biomedicine and traditional medicine. I would say it's not straightforward using these modern concepts to analyze ancient Egyptian material, in part due to the risk of anachronism, and in part because it's often impossible to differentiate between the different sectors. And I have to say, particularly the professional and folk sectors can be difficult to distinguish. And so for these reasons, I use Kleinman's concepts only as heuristic devices. I don't use it as a model per se. In any case, a kind of strict differentiation between these three healthcare domains isn't necessary because they shouldn't be understood as entirely separate entities, but rather as intertwined categories that overlap to some degree. In an ancient Egyptian setting, the concept of professional, folk, and popular domains to some degree correspond to a division into literate and non-literate healing systems. So the professional domain is then represented by the medical texts, which, as I said, were composed by well-educated practitioners, and many recipes are attested in 2 or more copies across the medical corpus, indicating that this corpus is relatively standardized and a homogeneous practice. Whereas the practices of the folk and popular domains were only rarely recorded in writing and never in a systematic way. At the same time, equating the professional domain with literate medicine and the folk and popular domains with non-literate medicine is a little bit of an oversimplification. So for instance, we see some recipes in the medical text that we can, I would say, identify as originating in the popular domain. For instance, this text here, Papyrus Ebus 853, which is characterized as another medicament which women make. And these women are evidently lay women whose practices have then been recorded in the medical texts. And this example serves to demonstrate this overlap that we see between the different sectors of healthcare and highlights why I use Kleinman's concepts as heuristic devices only. So with this, I would say, very long introduction, I can now better outline the purpose of this talk. So I aim to gain a more holistic understanding of ancient Egyptian healthcare practices by looking beyond the medical texts and their predominantly professional context to examine healing activities recorded in other sources. More specifically, I examine treatments described in documentary texts, which arguably are the most descriptive and informative textual sources after the medical texts to explore the domains of professional, folk, and popular healthcare and how they kind of intersect. So today I want to introduce some of the documentary sources that describe healing activities, and I then want to try to compare them with the medical text to determine how they differ, how they correspond, and if possible, how each of these texts might be categorized in relation to the three healthcare domains. And in doing so, I will determine whether these documentary sources represent an extension of or a tradition separate from the formalized professional medical system, and in turn to what degree folk and popular healing practices can be accessed through the extant textual sources. And I'll also briefly talk about possible references to dietetic therapy, meaning dietary practices intended to prevent disease, promote health, or aid recovery, which is a theme I've come across in many of these texts. And then finally, I'll discuss how representative the extant source material is of healthcare practices in New Kingdom Egypt. Documentary sources, and among these particularly letters, present several accounts of healthcare. And from these texts, it's clear that 3 parties could be actively involved in medical treatment, and this consists of the medical practitioner, and this includes any practitioner with recognized therapeutic skills, whether they belong to the professional or the folk sector. It includes relatives, friends, or associates of the patient, and it includes the patient, him or herself, as we've also just seen a couple of examples of. Treatment wasn't necessarily restricted to only one of these parties, but could involve several or even all. And I divide the sources into kind of 3 categories according to the people involved in healing. So we have family and community care with the involvement of a recognized healer, we have family and community care without the involvement of a recognized healer, and we have self-medication. And here I haven't included a category for care provided by medical practitioners because this kind of care is almost exclusively described in the medical texts. And so today I really only have time to focus on the 2 former categories here. So if we look at the category of family and community care, where a healer of the professional or folk domain is actively involved, we see really that only a few documentary texts describe instances like this. And one is a letter from Dir el-Medina dating to the 19th or the 20th dynasty. It describes an interaction between an associate or a relative of a sick individual and the so-called magician of Selkis, who's a specialist in treating venomous animal bites and stings. So this magician is tied to specialized knowledge and disease conceptualization and treatment in the Brooklyn Snake Papyrus, perhaps indicating that this medical practitioner belonged as part of the professional domain. So the letter runs as follows. The magician of Selkis, Amenmose, is greeting his brother, the scribe of the temple and God's father, Piai, as follows. The God's father is sick. When my letter reaches you, you shall cause that one brings him 1 measure of nepi grain, 1 jug of syrup, and 1 jug of date juice of the festival. May your health be good. So the involvement of a magician of Selkis indicates that the sick priest has been stung or bitten by a venomous animal. Amenmose is then instructing the associate or relative of the sick man to bring nepi grain, syrup, and date juice. And significantly, of these substances, only date juice is attested in the medical corpus, but it's never used to treat an animal bite or sting. So this could indicate, 1, that the substances were not meant as materia medica, but instead represent a focus on providing sustenance for the sick, as we also just heard about. Or 2, if indeed intended as medicaments, the substances then appear to kind of fall outside of the professional therapeutic practice represented by the medical texts. And I would argue here that both the context of the letter and the medical authority of the magician of Selkis indicate that the substances were procured for the purpose of medical treatment. And the letter thus appears to provide an example of a medical practitioner of the professional domain prescribing a treatment that's not represented in the extant medical corpus. But the answer may also lie somewhere between these 2 alternative interpretations. So as I said, the substances were most likely intended as materia medica, but perhaps they reflect the use of diet as a medical tool. Now, dietetic treatment is not described in the medical texts, at least not in such a way as to be recognizable, but it seems to be quite abundant in the documentary texts, many of which focus on diet and or access to certain foods and drinks during bouts of illness. And so this might explain the kind of atypical or seemingly atypical nature of the treatments described in the letter compared to the therapies in the medical texts. If correct, dietetic treatment appears to be excluded from the professional medical practice, but may have been practiced by some healers of the professional domain, demonstrating again this kind of overlap between the different sectors of healthcare. Another letter from Dir el-Medina, this one dating to the mid-19th dynasty, provides an additional example of the fluidity of the different healthcare domains. So it describes a family's struggle to care for an ailing father, and its decision to consult the so-called wise woman on his behalf. And this title, Ta'rechet, is never mentioned in the medical texts, but the wise woman is described in several documents from Dir al-Medina as a medical authority, suggesting that she belongs within the folk sector. And the letter reads from the draftsman Nacht Amun to Chai and to Baki, the draftsman Nebre cannot sleep. Cause that one looks for some fresh goose fat and have it brought at once. Please go to she who knows of deaths. May my mother or my father go forth because of this. It is the Ba'u which are within him in this moment. Now, Nacht Amun and Chai are sons of the sufferer, and Baki is a grandson, so the letter provides an example of family caregiving. In the final sentence of the letter, as you saw, Nacht Amun identifies the cause of Nebre's condition as the Ba'u, so this is the manifestation of a god. And it's clear from several other texts from Dir al-Medina that the wise woman was regularly consulted on matters of illness and death because she was able to identify which god was the cause of these kinds of events. And so here, Nacht Amun wants the wise woman to use her ability to identify the cause of Nebre's condition, beyond, of course, the fact that it is the Ba'u. So this letter doesn't specifically state that Nebre is ill, only that he cannot sleep, but his condition is clearly serious enough to warrant consultation with the wise woman. And the reason for his sleeplessness could be nightmares and perhaps specifically ominous dreams, as suggested by the editor of the text, or his sleeplessness could be perceived as a symptom of illness. In any case, it's clear that Nebre's condition is thought to be caused by the Ba'u of a god. And significantly, this concept is never mentioned in the medical texts. That corpus does describe illness as caused by the gods, but never by means of the term Ba'u, which indicates that the healing activities described in this letter belong exclusively to the popular and folk domains and not to the professional domain. And this, of course, also would fit the evidence of the wise woman as a healer of the folk domain. The majority of the documentary sources concerning illness and treatment fall within the category of family and community care without the involvement of a medical practitioner. And that includes the following letter, which is from the 19th or 20th dynasty, again from Dir al-Medina, and it was sent by the man A'amek to an unnamed woman. And he writes, as for the matters of illness which you sent to me about, what is it that I have done against you? As for the remedies which you spoke about, did you send to me about them, and I did not give them to you? As Ta endures and as Thoth endures, I did not hear it from anyone. It was never said to me. And then, as you see, the rest of the text is really quite broken, but the purpose of the letter is at least clear. So here, A'amek emphasizes to the recipient of the letter that he didn't receive her previous request to obtain remedies. And neither A'amek nor the unnamed woman are explicitly identified as medical practitioners, so the letter most likely represents an example of community or family caregiving where either complete remedies or ingredients for remedies are requested and supplied within a social network. At the broken end of the letter mentions green plants and linseed, perhaps identifying some of the ingredients of the remedies. And while linseed, memi or mimi in Egyptian, is a common drug in the medical texts, green plants are not attested as a drug in that corpus. So the letter could be referring to a popular therapeutic practice not described in the medical texts, but of course, I would say the document is really too broken to determine this with any certainty. Again, it's also possible that the green plants and linseed were meant as basic foodstuff, whether as a kind of dietary treatment or not. Finally, I just want to compare the following undated letter, which again comes from Dir al-Medina. It states, please go to the scribe of the temple, Pa'iyaharu, and bring a sack of barley for Amenemope from him, as well as some honey and nehesh oil, and say to him, he's very, very sick, and also bring grapes for making a remedy. So here, both the sender and the receiver of the letter is unspecified, but the document most likely provides another example of community caregiving. And while these drugs are attested in the medical texts with honey, barley, and grapes used quite frequently, and nehech oil only rarely, they don't directly correspond to any surviving remedy described in that corpus. Even so, we can see, unlike texts 1 and 2, and possibly also text 3, the drugs employed in this text don't appear to reflect a treatment that's entirely different from what's found in the professional medical literature. Meaning, judging from the drugs alone, the treatment doesn't fall outside of the professional healthcare domain. And this may indicate that the sender and or receiver of the letter were in fact medical practitioners, but I would say it's just as likely that the drugs used in the professional and popular domains overlapped to a large degree. So I've really only had time to kind of show you a couple of texts today, but I would say they nevertheless demonstrate that healthcare extended far beyond what's recorded in the medical texts, as we've also heard, reflecting a pluralistic therapeutic landscape. And I think when read alongside the medical corpus, these texts show both overlap and difference. We have some treatments that resemble those in the professional literature, while others are entirely absent from it, like certain explanatory models of illness or possible dietetic practices. And this suggests that, and this is perhaps not very surprising, but it suggests that the medical texts represent only one part of ancient Egyptian healing practices. So by viewing the sources within the theoretical framework of healthcare domains, I think it may help us structure and understand the other kind of healing domains in Egypt. And while documentary sources may not provide systematic medical knowledge in the same way as the medical papyri, they offer valuable glimpses into how illness was managed in everyday contexts, including in the professional, the folk, and the popular domains. And especially the two latter are important, as most of the practices that existed in the oral sphere are, of course, lost to us today. But by considering these sources, we can begin to approach a more holistic understanding of illness and treatment in ancient Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. This was very interesting to see how those two popular and professional texts intersect and what role they probably played, balanced or imbalanced, in society. Are there any questions? Yes. So I'll start with John.
Hi, thank you very much, Sophie, for this, for bringing us outside of the so-called elite system and showing also something very important, the non-structured way or medical issue without practitioner. Just one question. When you, at the beginning, you stated that the medical text might represent the intellectual production of well-educated elite, what is based this statement? Just on the fact that they use writings, or something else?
Partly on the fact that it's written down, partly based on the content. So we have, the medical texts include references to myths, descriptions of other kind of religious elements that would have been, I think, only accessible to very few people. I mean, some of these myths that we see described in the medical texts we only find in maybe one medical text and never in any of the other sources from ancient Egypt. So I think this is a good kind of indication that that the people producing these texts, maybe not reproducing, but producing the texts, would have had an extremely kind of specialized knowledge that wasn't common to everyone. So it's based partly on this as well.
And that was my point, that probably they were reproducing, doesn't mean that they were producing, but probably also people reproducing this text may not be the well-educated elite, or whatever elite means.
But you would still need, if you were to read and actually understand the text, you would need a great deal of kind of background information before actually before actually understanding the text. I realize there's a difference between understanding and practicing, but
yeah, but as Tim shown yesterday, you can have a franchising of this, the diffusion of medical text as well. So
sure, but so I'm sure you know this old study about literacy from Baines and Eyre from the 80s, I think, where they estimate that it's only about 1% of the ancient Egyptian population that was literate. I think this is probably too low an estimate.
which I strongly don't believe.
Yeah, I think it's too low an estimate, but it's still, I still don't think that we're dealing with a very high portion of the population that was literate. So even if you could read and not understand the text, that still relegates it to a very small portion of the population.
Yeah, if you see the papyrus of Lahoun, you might change idea, because sometimes they use also for normal daily life communication. So I'm not sure it's so low, like 1%.
But then again, is Lahoun representative, or is it like Deir el-Medina? You know, we could go back and forth like this all day. But this is my impression of the texts, that based on also the text, the medical text that I'm currently editing, it has a lot of specialized information in it, and I would be very reluctant to kind of understand it as a text that was used by a large portion of the population.
Yeah, no, I never meant a large population, but I think a restricted class might be a little bit too limited, but it's just my opinion. Then literacy is a problem.
Thank you so much, Sophie. This was fabulous. On this thing, one additional thing I would add to it is for the certain things that really reflect like scribal practices in the medical text. So the use of rubricization, the setting out of the different texts as well, and how those fit into scribal practices that we see in other places. And then I think of that one recipe that begins with something that the lector priest found in a very specific place that was handed down from that to me reflects like a convention that appears in other kinds of texts and speaks to like being part of that scribal tradition, just to support what you're saying. I have a different question on this, the idea of dietetic things, which is really interesting. But my question is what separates like something that's like a special food that you might eat from a medicine? How do we tell the difference between those two things? This is like almost an existential question, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think we can unless they actually themselves identify it in the text like they do. I think Galen writes quite a bit on dietetic therapy, right? And he identifies it as dietetic therapy. And then, of course, we can say this was kind of the intended use of it, or the intended function, I suppose. So here we don't really have that luxury. I guess it's just kind of me thinking out loud and just posing a potential interpretation of kind of the fixation on supplying food and drink to people who are ill. Although it could, of course, also have to do with, very practical things like them not wanting to starve when they can't go out of the house and things, right? But so I just thought it was something to consider. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sophie, for this very interesting presentation. And I'm really sorry for everyone, but we'll return on some of the on the points in my presentation. Just to return to what was saying Gianluca before, I agree with you that when we deal with this text, we have first to look at very limited number of people, also because owning a text or being able to write a text does not necessarily mean that you're able to use the text in an effective way. On the other part, I think that also in the let's say in the ritual or spell, part of the spell in this text, I think there are ways of there are some elements that can be used also to understand if all this tradition was just part of the, let's say, high culture or something that was taken also from more folkloric tradition. For example, thinking at Deir Medina, I remember that there are some disease demons that are basically attested only in the texts that are in Deir Medina, which can be both understood as a particular high tradition of the place, but also something that was widespread in the community in a very popular culture, and that was taken in the text from, let's say, some more educated person. And I remember that, for example, Frankfurter, when dealing with the concept of demonology, says that it is basically when the high culture systematizes the traditions of spirits and ghosts that are widespread in the population. So I think that there can be ways of also using these apparently more complex texts from the culturally speaking, also to see if they were just born out from the high tradition and not also from the lower part.
And another approach to take here could be, great tradition, little tradition, to kind of to see how we might then sort of divide up these domains of healthcare in a way. This is something I have to think about a little bit more.
And the final question.
Okay. Thank you. I think one question is, how are you dealing with these different categories of text? They're also recording for different reasons. And so in like Papyrus Ebers, they're recording these because they're very specific measurements of various processes, and so it's something that's much harder to remember, or they're accumulating. I mean, when I'm imagining, we have examples of Astra that show that these are being accumulated and copied, versus a letter where you're asking for ingredients. And I ask because, like, if I think about my medical care, there's a lot of things that will never be written down, even if their doctor recommended. A doctor might say, "Yeah, why don't you take aspirin for that?" And because it's so common, it's not recorded.
Yeah.
And so maybe some of the differences you're seeing with which ingredients show up and don't might be because of the reason they're recording rather than because they're from different regions of medical.
Yeah, I mean, that could easily be the case. This is another pitfall of this sort of study, right? Where I think my main objective here is to, as far as possible, try to find all of these examples of, let's say oral practices that have been recorded, especially in letters, and then as far as possible compare them to this kind of standardized literature that we have, and when they don't fit, there are multiple interpretations, but it's a good point. It is a pitfall of the study.
Yeah. I mean, it just shows though that there's also potential. Because it's still illuminating something. It's just that maybe once you have more examples, it'll be easier to illustrate how these articulate.
I think this is also, sorry, can I? Yeah. So this study kind of sprang from another study I'm currently working on, which is kind of focused more on access to healthcare, where, because a lot of the drugs that they use in the medical texts are imported or otherwise difficult to obtain drugs. And so I'm trying to, as far as that's possible, see how accessible these different drugs were to then say, okay, how representative are these medical practices recorded in the medical texts? And so I think this work that I presented today will kind of be described an extension of that, so that it's part of, I think, a broader discussion that will maybe then
maybe bring those together.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Sounds great.
Thank you very much for those questions, all relevant and all probably needing more exploring and discussion, which
yes.
I definitely encourage to take during the break after the next speaker. So for now, thank you, Sophie. And And now we welcome the person because of whom we are here. So the creator of this conference, who had the idea to gather different specialists to discuss health and healing. So Gabriele Mario Conte, he will talk to us about a disease that I will contend with, anthropological significance of ancient Egyptian healing and instructions. There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. So for my presentation, I will begin again with the Italian traditional healers, which has already been addressed, were studied by important scholars as Di Martino, but also in lesser known books such as this one, La Lepre e la Luna, literally the hair and the moon, about traditional healers in the Apennines mountains. So what I always found very fascinating about these healers is that they often live in very isolated and rural areas, but were nonetheless very well known by the locals, who knew exactly where to go for every type of illness. Medicine, not only as a biological act, but also as a social one, requiring specific strategies to facilitate access and promote the healer's social position. So the success of these healers in the Apennine valleys was ensured by the effectiveness of their treatment and the subsequent word of mouth recommendations among the people. Consequently, I wonder whether it was possible to identify these dynamics also in a civilization such as the Egyptian one. So it is quite natural that the primary sources we can use in order to reconstruct these processes were written sources. But to do so, we must move beyond a biomedical approach to Egyptian medical sources that see ancient Egyptian healing as comparable to our own concept of medicine. Very often, Egyptian medical texts are approached to identify the diseases of our own medical tradition and to analyze the remedies according to the criterion of efficacy. Of course, this efficacy is usually the biomedical and biological efficacy. So how effective was the remedy in healing a specific disease? But how socially effective were ancient Egyptian healing remedies, and how important was the social position of the healer, and how can anthropology and sociology be useful in framing these topics in the Egyptian context? So my attention turned to a specific aspect of Egyptian healing texts and remedies, namely the so-called formula of prognosis, or maybe more correctly, verdicts. These formulas appear in a specific type of Egyptian healing text, the Shesau, and are usually placed after the description of symptoms and what we can call the diagnosis, and before the proposed treatment. The papyrus in which these formulas appear most frequently is Papyrus Edwin Smith, where they follow observations of wounds and fractures. We have three types of statements or verdicts. The first case is a situation in which a positive outcome of healing is expected and can be translated as a disease I can handle. The second formula can be translated as a disease I will contend with or I will fight with, and we can call it intermediate because probably indicates a more difficult condition which requires a more cautious approach. We know this because we have cases which clearly show that intermediate prognosis represent a subsequent level of difficulty. So for example, in the remedy group from 3 to 6 in Papyrus Edwin Smith, we see a progressive worsening of the described symptom with a consequent worsening of the prognosis, so from positive to intermediate to negative. As I said, prognosis usually follows the diagnosis and precedes the treatment. And the remedies in Papyrus Edwin Smith are surprisingly uniform, mostly limited to bandages, application of fresh meat, and dressings with oil and honey. Of course, a positive prognosis is a follow until recovery. Intermediate prognosis often involves a wait-and-see approach, with the person lying on the bed until reaches what Henry Breasted defines the decisive point, and James Allen the turning point, translating the expression er rechek seperef erhet, so literally, until you know he has come to something. The author himself of the papyrus explained in some glosses that this procedure is typical of intermediate prognosis and is aimed at the observation. Consequently, waiting for an improvement is part of the treatment of critical cases. After this, the remedy actually becomes quite similar to those for a positive prognosis. One might wonder what the point was of including this type of prognosis if in the end the outcome was positive anyway with application of the same remedies. So on the one hand, these served to highlight a more difficult process to which the healer had to pay attention. And on the other hand, a prognosis of this kind probably had a greater impact on those listening, emphasized by the use of this word-like vocabulary. But we will return on this later. And finally, yes, this was just a resume of the intermediate prognosis. And finally, we have negative prognosis, which we can translate as a disease for which nothing is done. Interestingly, without the first person, but in this case, in the impersonal verb. So Edwin Smith Papyrus contains as many as 12 cases of negative prognosis, a quarter of the total remedies. This is a very high number, leading us to ask why so many incurable cases were included in a treatise on healing. Most of these cases do not prescribe any form of treatment, and scholars have, however, noted that in some cases, observation and waiting for the turning point are prescribed even for negative prognosis. And sometimes we have also negative prognosis with remedies for positive outcomes, for example, the case 17. So we can conclude that the turning point reflects what occurred in the healer's experience. When after waiting the patient recovered, the prognosis was intermediate, otherwise it was negative. The formulas of prognosis are found only in a limited number of texts within Egyptian medical literature, so they were not necessarily a widespread and established practice. A significant number of these formulas can be found in the Ebers Papyrus. The formulas are found in the section of remedies from 857 to 875, known as the Book of Tumors, which is the only part of the papyrus containing Shesau. And it is also interesting to note that the only prognosis in the Edwin Smith Papyrus for conditions other than fractures were exactly for tumors. In the Ebers Papyrus, the vast majority of prognoses are positive, with only 2 intermediate cases and 3 negative ones out of 22. The intermediate cases are evidently more complicated situations since the condition has persisted for a long time, while negative prognoses are primarily linked to conditions attributed to supernatural forces, such as the god Khonsu. In addition to these formulas, the Ebers Papyrus contains a large number of a well-known and widespread type of formula found in medical texts, namely the sentence, truly outstanding remedy 1,000,000 times, and its alternatives, you will see results. So we can interpret them as alternative version of the positive prognosis describing the successful outcome of the treatment. The experiential nature of this text is evident in some variation of this usually highly standardized formula. For example, in case 418, the remedies is presented with this note, do it and you'll see results. Look, this is an appropriate remedy. So it seems also as the author trying to selling the remedy to someone who needs to be convinced at using it. But far more interesting is the comment on the remedy 509. So we can read a truly outstanding remedy. I have seen it. It happened often through my hand. So this note is very fascinating because it takes the medical text out of a purely scientific context and places it within a context of lived life and personal experience, where having repeatedly tested the remedy is the only way to present it as effective to other people. Another papyrus with a considerable number of prognostic formulas is Louvre 32,847. The papyrus contains a situation similar to those of Papyrus Ebers, as it mostly presents remedies for tumors and swellings, in particular cases of the tumors of Khonsu. The papyrus contains at least 20 observations accompanied by prognosis, of which only 2 are negative. So the most immediate interpretation of these formulas is as purely medical instruments related to the medical efficacy of the treatment. However, a more in-depth reading benefiting from the contribution of anthropological and ethnological theories can provide further levels of comprehension. I have therefore identified 3 levels of analysis of this formula: experience, self-promotion, and narration. So first of all, as I mentioned, the person of the healer frequently emerges in the instructions. Even when it is not expressed, the observations are framed as a dialogue between the healer in first person and the reader in second person. So this means that the prognosis formulas had an important metatextual function through which the author of the remedy enter into dialogue with other people, primarily other healers. This dialogue had as its primary purpose the transmission of a form of knowledge based on experience. So the Shesau texts have been recognized by scholars as casuistic texts, so texts which describe situations that had most likely occur in reality to some healer. We can understand it from the detailed description of the symptoms, which sometimes also contain the almost emotional reactions of the patient, and by the anomalous characteristics we have noticed. For example, the homogeneity of treatment indicates that the prognoses are a documentation of how often the known method was effective. And these also give an explanation of the great number of negative prognoses in some of the papyri. So it is not a great surprise that in a context still lacking scientific method as we are used to it, scientific discoveries were based on personal experience, and this was even recognized by the ancient themselves. So for example, empiricism was the name of a Greek medical school that promoted the importance of direct experience over theorization. And of course, the fact that every physician acted based on his experience with very different remedies for same conditions was also a topic for satire in the course of history. About this topic, I would like to mention this passage from the Uyun al-Amba fi Tabakat al-Atibba, so really sorry for my Arabic, by the Syrian writer Ibn Abi Usaybia from the 13th century, which is a sort of history of medicine, and the author seeks to find which is the origin of medicine. And in this passage, he says that medicine was born in Egypt when a sick woman consumed a plant, Elecampane, that she found beneficial to her condition, and starting from this, through another series of experiments based on experience, medicine was born and transmitted to the next generation. So from this perspective, prognoses are the seal of the experience accumulated by healers over time and transmitted in the Shesau. It is difficult to determine whether this experience was related to a specific figure or school, as occurred, for example, in Greece. But the use of recurring formulas demonstrated a certain search for systematization and establishment of a recognizable textual tradition. Some authors argued that this systematization aims at constructing a nosology at the service of medical education. However, this interpretation is not accepted by everyone. For example, Bardinet notes that the meticulous description of symptoms does not correspond to an equally precise naming of diseases. And the homogeneity of remedies raises the question of whether there was a real connection between the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the treatment in this succession. So the impression is that these formulas were not connected to the description of the symptoms, but were a consequence of the treatment. So the prognosis was not based on the observation of symptoms, but on the outcome of the remedy, which was applied in any case. So the aim is therefore to provide a practical repertoire for immediate application more than a theory. And this repertoire was based on previous experiences within a medical tradition that over time became increasingly crystallized through the textual medium. Healers, however, were not the only level addressed by the text. The formulas are usually introduced by the verb jed, so they were to be pronounced in front of the patient and likely relatives and acquaintances. The prognosis also therefore had a social functions, and Zucconi, for example, notes that these formulas had the power to change the person's status depending on their health condition. So a positive prognosis means that the person will soon re-enter the social fabric in an active manner. An intermediate prognosis places the person in a suspended state with all that is entailed also in terms of work organization. And finally, a negative prognosis irremediably changes the person's status, presumably leading to death or an impairment that necessitated care from the rest of the community. But formulas had another function in society. And to introduce this topic, I would like to propose a comparison with a text from the Hippocratic corpus, specifically the treatise called Prognosticon, which deals exactly with the topic we are addressing. So at the beginning of the treatise, the author stated that it is necessary, therefore, to learn the nature of such diseases, how much they exceed the strength of man's body, and to learn how to forecast them. For in this way, you will justly win respect and be an able physician. For the longer time you plan to
to meet each emergency, the greater your power to save those who have a chance of recovery, while you will be blameless, anaitios, if you learn and declare beforehand those who will die and those who will get better. I find it very interesting that the usefulness of prognosis lies also in the healer's reputation. So he's being blameless, of course, in the events of things going badly. In context where there is no impersonal discipline based on a method, the value and reputation of the doctor become even more important, because based on these elements, people could evaluate the effectiveness of the method. From this perspective, prognostic formulas serve to safeguard the doctor's authority, protecting him from failures that could compromise his position within society. So the formulas had an important social role that can be interpreted through the concept of social capital. Social capital is the set of resources and opportunities embedded in the establishment of a social network. In this context, we can see that the healer builds a social network based on trust and reliability once the remedies are successful. And this social capital is materialized and embodied in the accumulation of text, which is a feature of Egyptian medical literature, and which seems a bit strange from our idea of medical text based on academic and scientific purposes. The embodied social capital procures benefits to the person who was able to build it, in particular enhancing his position and prestige within the community. We know that ancient Egyptian healers gave great importance to the prestige acquired through their profession, as is evident, for example, in the inscription from Hatnub. And often they also emphasized the ability of their fingers, because auscultation was an important way for recognizing this condition. So the physician is skilled, of skilled fingers. In some other passages from medical papyri, we also note how medical skill was linked to divine favor. And these are all aspects that are attested also in other culture and traditions in Africa or Asia. So both the importance of the healer's reputation and the divine favor that is at the basis of this reputation and successful treatments. So the healer's success and reliability are crucial in shaping the response of the patients and in determining their strategy, which ultimately results in the choice of one healer over another. And moreover, blaming the healer is one of these cultural strategies which justify failure without affecting the belief system underlying the healing ritual. And therefore, knowing in advance the curability of an illness allowed the healer to direct the practice and to negotiate the outcome before the rest of the community. A final level of interpretation concerns narration. So medical anthropology has highlighted how illness is also a cultural construct, which is narrated and systematized based on different cultural frameworks. So the narration of an illness is not simply an exposition of an objective fact, but is based on the lexical and cultural choices we make when describing it, and reveals a great deal about the attributes that are most important in the eyes of the speaker. For example, in one of his articles dealing with the perception of illness in modern USA community, Roy Andrade states that the attributes of diseases with which informants are most concerned and which they use in making inferences about diseases are not the defining or distinctive features, but the connotative attributes of seriousness, contagion, curability, and the like. For example, what people know about cancer is not what defines a cell as cancerous, but rather that having cancer is often fatal and painful. Similarly, Egyptian healers seem to visualize diseases not on the basis of their biological, pathological characteristics, but rather on whether they are curable or not. For example, Breasted himself recognizes that these formulas are not pronouncements on the case itself, but rather declaration of intent on the part of the healer, to the point of calling into questions the use of the term prognosis and proposing the term verdict. But the most important aspect is their metatextual relationship, particularly with an often overlooked protagonist of the medical act, so the third parties, so those who accompany and support the patient. These are usually more receptive to medical discourse because in some way they become the ones who ensure that the remedy is followed until its conclusion. So, thus, the idea of illness enunciated by the healer was likely appropriated by the listeners, both to determine future actions and also to grasp the general concept of healing. And in this sense, I find the intermediate prognosis particularly interesting, since it uses a terminology linked to the military sphere with the verb aha, so to fight. So healing is a fight, and as such, it was also presented to the public, constructed an almost heroic image of the healer. At the same time, this image was consistent with the general Egyptian worldview, which saw illness as a violation of the order established by creation. So in the last slides of my presentation, I will return on something that was already addressed by Sophie, exactly proposing the same, same scheme that she already used from the work of Kleiman. Just to have an idea of what happened beyond the text. So as we have said, in ancient Egypt, access to text was likely limited to a small number of people. And moreover, anthropologists such as Kleiman have noted that in many societies, access to a professional is only the last resort or access to treatment. Again, Arthur Kleiman identified three systems of healing: the professional one, the folkloric, and the popular, and the latter is represented by remedies and treatments provided within the family, which are often the first to be consulted, as it always happens in our personal experience. This dimension is unfortunately really difficult to notice in Egyptology, except for well-known cases. For example, I will resume again the case of the of the Rekhet in Deir el-Medina, because what particularly interests me in this case is the fact that the sources show how recourse to these figures was based on word of mouth among the inhabitants, who recommended going to her, probably based on previous positive results. And also the case of Jedor the Savior is equally interesting. From his autobiography, we can infer that Jedor had achieved great fame within the community, which went beyond his normal duties and also involved his role as a healer. So we can therefore speculate, also referring to what was said at the beginning of the presentation, that the mechanism of social promotion of healers based on experience, success, and public acceptance were also valid outside of healing based on written texts. And just to stay in Egypt, also, even if in more recent times, I would like to conclude with this passage from the work Tibal Rukka, so the Old Wise Medicine, published in 1892-94 in Cairo by Abd al-Rahman Ismail, so a doctor educated according to the dictates of modern medicine at the Kasr-e University, who wants to deal with the subject of popular and traditional medicine, mostly to show its falsity and backwardness. So to explain the meaning of the term rukka, the author says that in special circumstances, however, the word is applied to the women who are at home whilst the men are busy in the fields. For they usually gather together in the evening to perform whatever duties their husbands and masters may have imposed on them. Then the talk goes round amongst them at those times, and they boast of the success of a prescription which one of them has tried upon one of her daughters or on one of the members of her family. So from these few lines describing a scene that could easily have occurred in the rural community of the New Kingdom, and it is very similar to the passage of the Papyrus Ebers that Sophia showed at the beginning of her presentation. So we can see the mechanism of validation based on experience and social ties, in this case, the context of a family. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gabriella. Yes, question.
Thank you very much. There was a slide that it was a bit quick. It's about people's, how they feel about the disease, that they can, one of them was saying that he can deal with it or he can manage it. It was right at the beginning. It was, not sure I got that. So some people say that they can deal with it and others just cannot. That was before, yes, this was the one, I think. Or what?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, a disease condition I can handle. So yeah. Were there others, or a condition I will contend with? Should take a photo of this.
Yeah.
So could you explain this? I mean, they were saying that some people can deal with diseases and others not?
Yeah, basically the text in the text there is this prescription, these sentences that must be pronounced by the healer after examining the case of the person. And what is interesting is exactly that in some cases the healer had to pronounce a positive prognosis. So basically he was saying, I will heal the person. In some other cases, he was saying, I will fight with this, so it would be a little more difficult. And in cases, he will say, just, I cannot do anything. No, it was the healer. So it was in the text used by the leaders. And yeah, it is interesting because also in other culture, for example, I read a paper about medicine traditional medicine in Australia, and also in Australia, the Aboriginal healers sometimes they say, I cannot do anything about it. Just leave the situation because I'm not able to heal it.
Thank you, Gabriele, for your presentation. It was amazing. And what you were talking about made me think of what Thesordas baptized of rhetoric of empowerment, that are some sort of sentences that the healer says to himself, like in charismatic healing and in other traditional medical practices he studies, that he says like the healers repeat these sentences to convince himself on themselves that they can achieve to cure the people, but also to gain the trust of all the community. So I think that this is exactly the same, but in the ancient Egypt. And also, it is part of the placebo effect that we were talking yesterday. I don't like this placebo term because it's like some from the modern position, but I think that you understand what I am meaning. And also the point is that that saying that the healer is skilled in fingers, I think that you came across some remedies when the healer is describing the symptoms, saying that he has posed his fingers on the child. So it's so amazing that everything like puzzles together and you bring that to us. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, regarding the placebo effect, I think that is something that maybe we'll address at the end of the conference, because I think that it is a useful concept, but it has to be better framed. So usually in Egyptology, it is used as a magical word for everything that we cannot understand with the, let's say, in the perspective of modern medicine. So everything that it is outside is just placebo effect. But actually, the placebo effect is based on cultural and social phenomena that justifies it. It's not something that happens just out of nowhere.
I have a very short comment and then a question related to this. This a'at net khansu that you mentioned, that's not actually what the text said. The editor is wrong. It's a shenet net khansu. It's an incantation of khansu. But so, in relation to these verdicts, I was thinking about, what is a successful treatment and what is not a successful treatment. So of course, on the one hand, at one extreme, an unsuccessful treatment would be, the immediate death of the patient, right? And on the other hand, the other extreme would be the immediate return to, the exact same health that you had before. But that's not actually what it is that they're saying, right? They're saying they can treat it. Well, they're saying that they will treat it, but not necessarily what the effect will be, right? Or how do you understand this?
I understand it in the sense that a successful treatment is something that has proven as successful in the experience of someone else. So if a remedy gives some results at certain point in one particular case, this was noted and transmitted as successful for other healers that could access these texts.
So just any condition that improves just a little bit?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it is really difficult to assess how much they were
they were
What is the
successful in
success
a
criteria?
in our medical concept, even because exactly most of them are actually quite palliatives for situations that maybe continue to be quite painful for the person. But of course, we have just the remedy proposed and the sentence of the year that says, for me, it is successful.
Yeah, exactly.
So beyond that, I think that is really difficult to assess, and probably many of these, even the positive outcome, were not quite really positive, at least from what we perceive as a real healing, a real
I agree.
positive outcome.
I agree. It may be just kind of identify, I guess, what you define as a success criteria and what maybe the Egyptians did.
Yeah, okay.
Can I just add to it with a sort of question, I don't know, comment, but is the success on the side of the healer or the patient?
Thank you so much, Gabriel. This is speaking to many things I've been thinking about as well, and it was great to see it brought together as you have. One thought on the Hippocratic prognosticon and what the similarities there or differences might be. One thing I reflect on is that a lot of the way that prognosis is talked about in the Hippocratic context reflects upon the idea of competition between different physicians or other types of healer in particular. And I think it's in the same text where the writer criticizes those who give too optimistic prognosis and promise miraculous things, and is instead advocating that a good physician, by which we presume he means himself, would not do this for the sort of reasons set out there. And I was wondering, when we're thinking about in the context of ancient Egypt, how much we might want to think with the idea of competition at all. And what you think about
the point is, I think that we have very, very few information about it, but it's something.
No.
Is something that I thought about preparing this presentation, but I decided to just leave it a little outside, both because I am not a real specialist in Greek medicine, and also because we have very few attestation of these dynamics. So I know that in Greek medicine there were schools that sometimes were in competition, that someone was very critical about the another healer.
Some debate about the actual existence of specific
exactly.
schools, but yes.
In Egypt, honestly, I don't know. So I assume that maybe, I mean, one of the ideas that I had preparing this presentation was exactly that these formulas were part of also a tradition related to someone who proved some of these remedies and transmitted this knowledge among these disciples and successful. But honestly, I think that we have very, very little details to assess it. Probably.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage thinking that this is a point of difference between what's going on in the Greek tradition and what's happening in Egypt, because as far as I can think, there's nothing that talks about like competition in the same way, and I think what you pull out here about the idea of its power within the community to be able to make those prognoses is far more like really picking out what might be going on. So yeah, thank you.
In this case, it's also interesting the concept of medical pluralism that was introduced. So the idea that which for us is a bit strange because we have a more systematized, but in reality no, because also in our society there are several ways of accessing healthcare, but especially when there was no scientific method which with this, let's say, perception of reality in respect to the other tradition. So I think that it was something yeah, that was more important. Also, the competition between different healers and what they proposed.
So I thank you very much for your talk. I would like to make an observation rather than a question, starting from Anne's talk, because actually you noticed that part of the care is providing food, providing drink, providing clothes, which is something very attested, very well attested in a repetitive way in hieroglyphs and medicine. But medicine is more rarely attested, and it's something that I say, why is not so clear? I mean, it's something that should be part of almost daily life, like. And then starting with some Gabriele observation, especially at the beginning when you quoted Ernesto De Martini and you said that medic happens especially in secret places, and especially the ruka or the reket. I mean, the knowledge sometimes is even restricted. So would just like to help to think about this idea that at one point, as Sophie showed, is a family extended community, but at the same time should be also restricted knowledge, or should be hidden, or should be in a place that is not well known, or should be a little bit obscured. So I think it's something that probably I can invite for further research about the places, virtual and practical, of medicine.
And yeah, and it's exactly the point. It was this idea of social cohesion and word of mouth dynamics to basically say yes, this healer was effective with me. I mean, what he did was useful for me, so I recommend it to you. Please go to her in the case of the racket, because it will be beneficial to you. But of course, there are a lot of things that remains in outside the written tradition as we are used to.
Thank you. This was very illuminating, nice lecture. The whole session actually had me thinking about how, as Egyptologists, we keep this divide between folk and official religion, elite and non-elite, royal, non-royal. But in fact, my impression is that, especially with magic or medical text and medical text, there's not much of this divide, in the sense that this seems to me really, this seems to be a system of knowledge that is broadly used, and much more democratic than we think. And it's the same as when you start to study the Book of the Dead and they say, and it's non-royal funerary text, and then you found out, well, it's not true at all, right? It was, all those system of knowledge were much more mixed than what we think. I wonder what you think, since you're reading so much anthropological literature and you're making really great comparisons. Don't you think it's maybe time to start quitting this, our understanding in terms of folk versus official medicine, same as folk or popular versus official religion? Can we try, or
yeah,
not yet?
Definitely, or maybe also try to maybe reframe these concepts, in the sense that not just to assume that there were stark distinction between different fields that did not communicate, but maybe to define different contexts where the healing know-how was formed and transmitted. So, for example, yeah, the house of the ladies that meet at the evening, just talking about what they did with their daughter, is maybe a different context from the place where scribes collected the know-how and inscribe it. But of course, in a sense, they also connected, because maybe exactly the remedies that were discovered by the ladies in their personal experience somehow found their way into the text. So maybe we can use this different concept of popular folk, etc., in a different way, not for different practice, but for different context of transmission and creation of the know-how.
Thank you very much for the very interesting and eye-opening talk. So I come from a different background, so perhaps not Egyptology, archaeology. As a medical historian, I'm going to start with your final kind of slide with Abdurrahman Ismail and Tib al-Rukka. When he wrote this book, Egypt was in transition. It was moving away from... There was a scathing attack in his book on folk medicine and on women. The women who practiced. And there were attempts at the same time to criminalize a lot of the folk practices, such as the zar, etc. Now, it is a testament that the fact that these practices continue until the present day, but mainly women during this time had to, came under attack, and many of them were not able to practice. And so there was a clear hierarchy during this time between male and female healers. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about whether that existed, if there was a hierarchy or a differentiation between the women and the men who were practicing at this time. Thank you.
You mean in ancient Egypt?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. I think it is a topic that would deserve another conference, maybe. Yeah, for sure. The titles that we have, the titles of healers that we have from ancient Egypt are mostly male titles. I think that there are just a couple of attestation of a female. A word for physician in the female form. So probably at the level of official titles, it was a male conducted practice. At least they were probably the ones that had access to the text, for example. But of course, the case of the Rechet, unfortunately, it is very, very isolated, and it is always mentioned because it's the only one that we know about. We know something, but probably shows that there was a strong tradition. Also, the case that Sophie showed in her presentation, that showed that there was a practice of something that was maybe conducted by women. Also, everything that was related to pregnancy, fertility, and birth giving. We have elements to say that probably was something that was administered, was dealt with by women.
Okay, I think we'll give Gabriela some rest now. I think we will all do with a short respite from discussion. So I invite you to take a break. We only have 15 minutes. I allowed Gabriela to take all those questions because obviously he's the organizer. So, privileges. So we have 15 minutes, and I would like to see you all back at 4:15. You're free to grab your drinks and come with your drinks. We will have final two speakers, and use your time to think about questions for our final discussion. Go and rest. Thank you.
No. It's a specific term that relates to this kind of text, which can be translated as a form of knowledge based on experience, exactly, on direct observation. Because the verb itself gives an idea of experimenting on testing the things. Yeah, it's a term of a specific kind of text, exactly the one where you find also these problems.
Yeah, technically yes. Gabriele. Gabriele, where's my?
Which repeat the title?
Wait, I don't know.
It was the copy.
Copy. This one.
Which one? This. This. Wait.
Grab your drinks, grab your snacks, take your seats.
Is it PDF? Okay,
Yeah,
I
it's a
have,
PDF.
I have to ask.
Yeah, but he told me that he needs to ask something because it's a PDF. No, it's already, but the point is that it's a PDF because I have a yeah. So Gabriel has to ask.
One second, because I cannot find Cinderella and I don't remember how to put the presentation mode for the PDF.
Okay.
So, but I think that Cinderella will be back soon, hopefully.
We're just working on some technicalities here.
It's because it's a.
Yeah, I don't know how to start the presentation. I mean, in order to make you skip,
Okay.
if you know the Mac. No. Someone knows how to use a Mac.
can figure out as a group what's the issue. Is it sharing it on both screens? Is that the issue?
Rotate left. No, this one.
Maybe in view.
Share the doc. Yeah, maybe it's slideshow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
No, wait, look, and they have to get it up there.
Oh.
Okay.
No, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, because also before there was the same problem with the.
Just drag onto there. Okay. So we just open it up.
Oh.
Twice. Yeah. So bring it over. And then you can do the view slideshow there.
I don't see.
That's fine, because we can open it twice if we need. That was what they had to do before, is they opened it twice.
Okay, we are really smart. But I cannot.
Is that okay for you?
Can you change?
Okay.
Can I change? Oh, yeah.
I think yes.
Yeah, just put the cursor.
Oh, okay, no, with okay.
Sorted. Brilliant. Welcome back, everybody. So in the final part of this final session, we have two presentations. So the first up is Clara Martinez Moreno from the University of Barcelona with the talk on the ancient Egyptian cosmos mirrored in healing practices, a study proposal. Clara.
Thank you. I will just start thanking Gabriele and both institutions for making possible such a stimulating conference. And also I would like to extend my recognition to all my colleagues for the contributions too. As the title says, I would like to present to you how the conceptions on ancient Egyptian cosmos were also underlined in ritual healing practices. I want to be explaining what is a diatomatical or medicomatical papyri because we have already talked about that. But my point is that these textual sources could be also useful devices for understanding how healing practices were culturally constructed by identifying their linguistic and performative mechanisms. Because since they are textual sources, they were cultural products and they were created in a culture that is ancient Egypt and not in a vacuum. The point is approaching medicine as a cultural system following the methodologies of Kliman, Rhodes, or Hesu. And also THISA has already demonstrated its applicability in the Mesopotamian case. And I really recommend you to read his work if you are interested in this kind of approaches. This is how a remedy is displayed, but the point is that I ask these remedies and these sources the following question: were sociological categories called upon and involved during ancient Egyptian healing processes? And when you read sociological categories, you may read ontological realm, ethnicity, status, and gender. I asked all these sources, the medicomatical papyri from Middle Kingdom to New Kingdom. These texts are the corpora for my PhD, and obviously there are not all the remedies, but those who have, to a bigger or lesser extent, the presence of female patients, because it's the object of my research. And I have pointed to the two main points are the text for my methodology is the textual layer reading, analyzing lexica, syntax, grammar, textual structure, intertextuality, materiality, etc., and also applying semiotic, sociological, and gender studies methodologies, asking to what extent we can understand ritual healing as a social activity, reflecting about agency, hierarchies, dominance, and also putting everything in relation with culture-specific ideas, like emic ideas about disease, healing feelings, and also mythology, the passing experience, etc. The point is that obviously we cannot ask Egyptian people about how they felt after they have been healed, or how the ideas were transmitted in their bodies, and how it had some consequences in their own perception or the perception of the healing experience. But I believe it is interesting to apply this methodology to the sources to make new questions and get new answers. About the textual layering, I have identified, or I work on 4 layers. The first one is the most obvious one, is how the texts talk about healing procedures, the typology of the remedies, the ingredients, the verbs for healing that we were talking all these 2 days. The second layer will be the methodological concepts, the historical, the archetypes, how the divinities are transfigured with the healer, with the aid, with the patient, how they are invoked in different contexts and pathologies, and why. The third layer will be the ontology, how the body is conceptualized, the male, the female, and the fourth layer will be this, the main topic of this talk, that are the sociological categories, the identities, and the self. After that, I follow also Fesorda's approach to the ritual healing as a social activity, and this author divides between perception and practice. And from my perspective, these two questions could be also applied to iatromatical papyri, because we have the perception of the composer or the copyist that is normally anonymous, and it has intellectual prevalence because, at least as Gabriele said, has technically already applied this treatment. We have also the healer and the agent, because it's sometimes someone with a special knowledge, skills, and effort to mobilize the heka, and also it appears as the subject of all the agential verbs. And we also have the patient that normally is anonymous and is who receives the treatment, normally appears as the object of the verbs. And also we have the practice, that is the performance itself and how it was embodied by the actants. And the author divides between procedure, process, and outcome. And this is, in reality, something difficult to address in ancient Egyptian text, because there's some information that is missing. But we can search for who does what to whom concerning the treatment, how the participants could experience these encounters with the sacred and with these healer practices, and the outcome that will be the efficacy. When we identify the personhood of the self in Egyptian medical text, we see a division between humans, divinities, and spirits, and this division comes as with no surprise, because it's the division we often see in ancient Egyptian cosmos. And I have just brought some of a bunch of terms that refer to one of these categories, that following lack of linguistical approach will be the basic level categories, okay? And then if we apply to these terms the Fesorda's methodology, we see that for the perception, they are permeated with different categories. The thicker the line, the more they appear related to this category. I try to make it like visual, so that's why I search different hieroglyphs, but the point is that, for example, for humans, we can see them as male and female, but normally they appear as female until proven otherwise, because the percentage of remedies for female individuals are just gynecological. Mostly, they appear as patient, but also as healer. They are assumed to be Egyptian, and they can also inflict illnesses, because there are some human bites on some courses made by humans to other humans. The divinities, they are mostly male, but it's true that there are some agency related to female divinities, mostly Isis, so it's more, the percentage is bigger. Also, they appear as patients, but mostly as agents, because they are invoked even when the humans are the ones being the patient, the agents. They can also afflict the diseases and the illnesses, and they are mostly Egyptian, but there are also references to divinities coming from abroad. And for the spirits, their main role is to be attacking humans. There are male and female, and there are also appearing from Egypt and also to other countries. When we see what each of these categories do, we can perceive that the idea of what they do connects with what they do in reality in the text, or how they are narrated and described. So the humans are mostly the patients, but they appear as the healers. They appear as the ones who are healed, the ones who are harmed, and also the ones who are beaten. And also the observers, it is the lesser mentions, but there are some mentions of family or people connected with the patient. The divinities are mostly the healers, but I also appear as patients, as I said. And also they appear as the ones who are beaten because healers, technically, they should come over the illness or the sickness. And the spirits simply appear as the ones who are harmed and the ones who are beaten. I am now coming to present you some examples where these categories and all these actions are represented. First one is this case of Papyrus Rheseum 4, where technically in the head it says another thing to do for him on the day he's born. So technically this remedy would be applied to a newborn, but if we follow reading the remedy, we see like the patient is also a female, because it's a human, a woman, a patient, because it says that the spirit that is represented as with different terms referring to have sexual intercourse, begets, embraces at night, the one who kisses, is attacking not the male patient, but a female that is presumed to be the mother, because she's referred not only with the S, but also as the meseset. Okay? And also another self is the healer, that is human, male, and with the expression jet herek emhet. This sort of attacks from a male spirit to a female patient, we already talked about that, they are at the Metsu, but it's very interesting because when we search for violence applied to women in ancient Egypt, the sexual violence is also there, and this is something that Marco Rios-Young has studied, so we can see like a relation between what social would be perceived as negative and violent for the women, and also in the healer context, because obviously this woman wouldn't want to be impregnated by the spirit. Another example is this in the papyrus hairs, the remedy 160. It refers to the meshepenet, that it's often translated as a skin disease, but the point is that in this case, the illness that is addressed in feminine terms, like she who set something in motion without using her two arms. The patient and the healer in this case come from the divine realm, and it's Horus, reference in Exa Usir, the son of Osiris, and also we have the A1 as the suffix for the first person, the E. Like, shall not be in my limbs flow out. Interestingly, a divine female self is mentioned. The spell of my mother, that is Isis, is the protection of my limbs. In this case, the agency is not connected to a female character, but it's true that she is mentioned as a way to enact the remedy. Another example is this from the Berlin 3038, where the male healer, that is presumed to be Egyptian, has to see the eyes of a female human Egyptian patient, and because he should look at the iris of her both eyes, referred with the set, okay, and also the term set and EOS. The point is that here the etiology is not related to a real condition, but to her resemblance to enemies, traditional enemies of Egypt, that are Asians with the term Aamo, and also Nubian, and this prognosis if the female patient has any resemblance, or her eyes have resemblance with these two ethnical groups, she will not give birth. So the case is not like a real condition, but how the Egyptians perceive these two communities as related to the Isefet. Last example is this in the papyrus laden E348. And in this case, we have two references to patients. It's not the patients, technically, because they are the family of the male patient, that it's a child, and it's identified with Horus, technically, because the term is hairdo, not its child. But I brought these examples because we see the sorrow of the family of the patient, because the text says that Isis cries, Nephthys shouts, says for his mother, the friends one of his mother, like there's like a bit of emotionality on this. And both female divinities asked Geb, the father of the gods, to do something to heal Horus. And from this divine realm, we go to the human realm, because it says that technically the god Geb says, send me a man, with the term es. And then when the remedy is explained, it says that this spell is to be recited over two figures of Thoth drawn in the hand of a man. So we have like the transfiguration of the human patient with this historiola, but then it should be applied to a man. Probably this term S will refer simply to the patient, not to another man, as Sophie Schott has published in some of her works. But maybe it's the relative, or we don't know because it's not explained. The point is that the categories, the sociological categories that we see in the ancient Egyptian healing are mirrored with the ancient Egyptian society, because we have the spirits go over, divinities go over spirits and humans, but it's true that humans can act through ritual upon divinities and spirits. And also that happens with other sorts of rituals in ancient Egypt. The male agent is predominant over the male patient, female patient, and female agent, because he's more mentioned. And obviously, as we were talking before, probably it depends of the espace social de l'écrit, of the people who probably wrote these texts that were male members of the male elite. And we see that also in other texts and in other sorts of sources, that the male is the norm, and it is related not just some sort of male, but with the demonic masculinity. The female normally in the text are presented and created as the otherness, and it depends also on the heteropatriarchal society. Then we have the status, and connected with Gabriele was saying, the healer is the agent and has some knowledge related to him, whereas the patient is the object and is obviously in a moment of vulnerability, that is being ill. And then in the ancient Egyptian society, we have the elite members that have a predominance over commoners, and this predominance is related with economical, symbolical, and cultural capital. And then ethnicity. We have diseases that come in from outside, but also the body the individual body can be perceived as a microcosmos of Egypt itself. And in ancient Egyptian society, the Egyptian are always above the non-Egyptian, and all together creates the term Ma'at. But my question goes, and it's not yet answered, to one extent these ideas were transmitted to the people besides the ones who read and copied the text. So I am working, and it will be like the next project, how the ritual enabled to create and recreate the identities. So it's true that there are some parallelisms between healing as a ritual system and also ancient Egyptian rituals in general, because we have orality, we have performance, we have materia medica, and there will be like some sort of a memory, as we see with the bones that has been healed, but something like that. And we have the same for ancient Egyptian rituals. And I believe that through this repetition and with this explanation of the of how has been to being healed and oral elements that probably will be very difficult to find out, there will be some transmission of these cultural concepts and ideas, as happened with the rituals, as happened with the lectures of literature, etc. And we are now in the final remarks, and the point, or from my perspective, the recognition of the perception of and practice in healing procedures allows us to establish the meaningful connections between ideological principles belonging to ancient Egyptian society, and the dramatical papyri should be perceived as an artificial memory of the voice of the healing liturgy, the procedure, and also the memory of their cultural behavior that will be perception. Selves in ritual healing can be identified as a small-scale representation of ancient Egyptian societal identities, not as isolated, but taking part of a cultural perception of the world. Egyptians over foreigners, men over women, divinities over spirits, etc. And by this sort of papyri, ancient Egyptian scribes created a narrative about the healing procedure together with their explanation of the ancient Egyptian cosmos and social order. The point is that to what extent these ideas were transmitted to the rest of the society, and if they were effectively embodied, we don't know. But it's, I think it's useful to ask, at least. And also, if we take into account how the medical discourses function in other societies, it's probably that this question was answered simply with the naturalization of the cultural norms and the domestication of the bodies. Furthermore, as I was saying, would be directed to the ritual grammar of healing practices and the interconnection between ritualization and identities formation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Clara. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes?
Thank you for your paper. Can I have you go back just one slide? So, this one. This. So one of your kind of concluding remarks is this point about small-scale representation of ancient Egyptian societal identities. And so I just want to come back to the discussion that we had before about how representative these texts are, and consequently how representative this representation is. What's your take on this?
Yeah, my take would be that this representation is like the ideal of the people who were composing and reading the text, and that's the question that we don't know to what extent these ideas were shared by everyone. But if we analyze literature, there are also some sociological ideas and some, for example, the teachings that say how to be a good Egyptian. At one extent, these ideas were transmitted, but I think it's more or less the same. And indeed, I believe that the same social group were creating all these ideas because there are some parallelism. So I think that that's the point. Obviously, I think that I am working more on the abstract world, on the ideal world, and not something like real material, so that's really difficult to discern. But yeah, I don't think if I answered the question. Okay, thank you.
I think in this that it is also important that these texts were also something that were exactly performed. So when something is performed, it is transmitted not just on the patient, but also on probably the other people who were listening, and they appropriate everything that they listen, maybe in different ways. such as happened today when we listen to something that the doctor says to us. Maybe we understand completely differently from also with for our disadvantage, but this creates new ways of visualizing both the disease itself and everything that was culturally constructed around disease based on these exactly on these cultural and social frameworks.
Yeah, because if we think of the remedy of the Asians and Nubians, technically and scientifically it has no relevance. It's something that they felt that it was bad because their conception of Egyptian was and the enemies of Egypt was like this. So, and also how for example, the remedies that we were talking about yesterday that are written in the skin, obviously not, but maybe they didn't know, the patient, that this was Horus and all the mythology of Horus, but they could understand that if you have thought of written in your mouth, in your hand, that seems that maybe you will get better, and it's the same with the amulets. There are lots of amulets with more rich, more like with lesser quality, but maybe these people had no idea of all the methodology surrounding this object, but they felt that it was something connected with the divine world with the protection.
Thank you. I mean, from my perspective, it's an expected result that these would really reflect the kind of representation of ancient Egyptian societal identities, since that's how they're being produced. So as you were looking at these examples, were there moments where you found things that were actually quite contrary to the norms that we would expect? Because I think those would be pretty exceptional, and then maybe tell us a little bit too about how these are being constructed and when and why they might contradict norms.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I was analyzing female agency, yeah, you have some glimpses of female agents doing something, and I feel like, oh, okay, that's a good thing. But when I put everything in context, when Isis does things, normally she is connected with Horus, and mostly of the example says my mother Isis, or Isis as the mother. So at one extent, Isis is the great of magic, that indeed she is, but at the same time, her role is connected to the care of motherhood. So I think that there are not anything that breaks with the social norms, because it's not the point. They don't want to, from my perspective, the text don't want to show something that will be against the social norm, but instead, like, they are reaffirming, probably without being aware of that, because the people who composed the text were so embedded by these ideas that. But I think that it's interesting for us to ask at what extent the medical discourses were also social discourses, because, for example, if the healer does not attack the spirits, the patient won't be okay, for example. So if all these mechanisms go correctly following the math, the patient will be healed. So everything should be like in order.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. There is something, but I didn't really grasp. I don't know. I found that you have divided your topic into the gender of the healer and the patient. Is the gender of the healer could have an effect with the relation to the patient? If, for example, a woman could choose a woman, or a woman is specified in a certain disease or healing some genealogical, for example, diseases that could be shameful somehow for some women. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's another part of my PhD, and it will be another talk. But indeed, it's really difficult to see female agency outside the divine realm. So, and that's also, I don't know if she's over here, Vittoria Repisarda, she's working on midwives. So it's really difficult to see that. And in the text, normally the healer is referred in masculine. But it's a really interesting point is that when Isis is addressed while talking, for example, the suffix for referring to the subject is not feminine like the B1 or even the divinity. The sign is the A1. Like from the perspective of the healer, the text was talked from the male point of view, because there are some other examples that you can see the B1, but normally it's always like, and there's like, this is an incoherence between the embedding context and the embedding context, if we address to the linguistical point, like because in the narrative part, they say that it's Isis, and technically the text should be written in feminine, but there's this incoherence probably because the agency is thought in male terms.
Okay, that was the final question. We have to get on with the program. So thank you very much. And now on to our final speaker, Jasmine Sahu-Hoff from Yale University, with a talk on disability and the dynamics of healing in ancient Egypt.
Okay, so let me find, I think it will be this one.
Yes, but first we have to...
yeah, let me do that.
We have to change these.
You skip the cursor that way, it should go into this other screen.
Sorry?
Keep going.
This one?
There it is, up on the screen. She's up there. So, there we go.
Okay.
I can do this.
Okay. If you know how to do it.
This is why I was glad to see a Mac, because I was like, I got this. I know what I'm doing with the Mac. Whereas as soon as we get into Windows, then I'm lost, I'm afraid. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. And many thanks to Gabrielle and to EFAO and the Polish Center for this really wonderful conference. It's been so interesting to hear from everyone. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of the research I've been doing for my PhD dissertation, which is overall a comparative study of approaches to infertility in ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek healing institutions, viewed through the lens of disability. So I work from a critical disability studies perspective on disability, which highlights the way that social, culturally contingent structures create disability. To sort of boil it down, this whole idea comes originally from what is called the social model of disability, which differentiates between impairment on the one hand, which is something that is part of the body, and disability on the other hand, which is part of how society views certain bodies and how the structures of society limit certain bodies and what they can do. So critical disability studies take some issue with like completely separating out the idea of impairment and disability, but it hangs on to this appreciation of the fact that it's not someone's body that makes them disabled, as if that quality was something intrinsic, but rather the values that are written onto their bodies that creates the dynamic. Now, infertility might seem, from a modern perspective, as a slightly odd pairing with disability. It's sort of debatable today whether or not infertile people would be counted as disabled. You know, on the one hand, you have the Supreme Court in America confirming that having children constitutes a major life activity and therefore it's going to be covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. and others noticing that particular stigma attaches to women in particular who are diagnosed with infertility, and that medicalization of bodies around infertility concentrates on women in particular. On the other hand, people point out that women today their lives no longer revolve around childbearing in the same way that they might once have done, so that not having children need not be quite as limiting as it once was. And this last aspect of that modern debate about infertility as disability has prompted some to suggest that even if infertility today doesn't constitute a disability, that it would have done in earlier historical societies. So Martha Lynn Rose, for instance, has claimed that for ancient women, quote, barrenness, not variant gait or asymmetrical body, would have constituted a meaningful category of physical disability, end quote. Now, Rose is a scholar of ancient Greek history, but scholars who have been looking at Egyptian evidence around infertility have often characterized the significance of that state in terms that would be compatible with thinking about it as a disability. So Janice DeWhite, for instance, claims in a sort of a broader look at women in the ancient Near East that for women, quote, infertility was a tragic physical and spiritual experience, end quote. While Manuel Juaneda Magdalena points out that, and I'm just going to give the English translation rather than the Spanish, you'll forgive me. He points out that women in ancient Egypt were more frequently stigmatized than men with the label of infertility. So they don't use the language of disability here, but they use descriptions and ideas that are commonly associated with disability in sort of modern discourse, particularly the idea of personal tragedy and also of a stigmatized physical state. So these scholars might well acquiesce to the idea of infertility as disability, is what I'm saying. However, the field of critical disability studies has sort of shown that when we use disability as a term, there's a lot packed into that idea. So to claim that infertility is a disability is to make a sort of implicit assertion about the overall structuring of aspects of society and also of thought, especially regarding the body in ancient Egypt. So what I'm seeking to do is to take the opportunity delivered by the fact that there's a relatively high proportion of material surviving that concerns fertility and women in a healing context to investigate the structures of healing through a disability lens, and so to determine whether the power dynamics that we see there would constitute a sort of disabling framework. In order to do that, it's important to take a look at the part that healing institutions play in constructing disability today. And we need to do this so that we can become aware of the assumptions that we're bringing to the table when we talk about disability. And in particular, the way that healing institutions shape our understanding of bodies and what it means to quote unquote fix them. Now, of course, I keep saying healing institutions, largely because when we're talking about the ancient past, I don't want to use a modern term that might not perfectly apply. But when I am talking in a modern context, I am really talking about medicine. And both critical disability studies and medical sociology have got an awful lot to say about the dynamics in medicine vis-a-vis disability, and not least because before there was the social model of disability, the primary mode of understanding disability is what is called in some circles the medical model. But to summarize the part that medicine sought to play, first, medicine is often understood to have a role in defining what disability is through the ways that it constructs the body. So it labels some bodies as being normal or others as abnormal by looking at the body broken down into parts and systems, and explaining how those features work, generally according to the function they were supposed to perform for a quote-unquote normal individual, In other words, there's a sort of teleological framework to modern medicine, and an individual with a body that works in a different way is sort of inevitably labeled as dysfunctional. This is a perspective that's known as functional determinism, but as the philosopher John Searle has shown, the idea of function is immediately imbued with values. So to give an example, if we think about describing the function of the muscles in the leg, if you think that the walking is a good thing, if you put that value onto it, you might describe the way that muscles are put together as being something that's directed towards the function of walking or towards the purpose of walking. In fact, we can talk about causes and effects and something that is a potential for something in the body to do without necessarily designating one particular action as being what it's there for, and therefore not privileging that way of looking at things. Second, medicine can construct disability by shaping responses to impairment. So that might be through having alienating diagnoses that decenter individual experiences in favor of that medical narrative that I'm just talking about. It might also be through a negative prognosis, so in giving a diagnosis and then imagining that that implies a tragic future. Or it might be through the kinds of treatments that they use, which might reinforce normative ways of functioning. Last but not least, medicine can assert social authority, which we'll be kind of talking about quite a lot in society more broadly, but we can kind of think of this as essentially the extent to which the medical understanding of disability predominates in society. Okay, so now without further ado, let me get into the ancient evidence, starting with discourses in the Magica Medical Papyri. And I want to start with a fascinating passage that comes from Papyrus Carlsberg 8, a late New Kingdom text. Quote, "Another method for knowing a woman not giving birth, you should place a tuber of onion for the night into her vagina until dawn. If a stench appears in her mouth, she will give birth. If, and we presume in the lacuna we have if not, she will never give birth." This is probably quite familiar to everyone in the room, and it's most often discussed because there's a Greek Hippocratic remedy that is very, very similar. But what I want to draw your attention to here is how this passage draws attention away from what I'm going to call the site of experience towards a different area. So this passage is what is known as a birth prognosis, and the opening gives a hint of the kind of circumstances where this might be employed. So there is as yet no pregnancy. What it doesn't give us a clue about is whether that's because somebody has been trying to become pregnant and that hasn't happened, so where they envision that there's a problem, or whether this sort of thing is done in sort of anticipation of trying to have a child. That information isn't available. What is clear that there is no pregnancy at the moment, and if we were going to try and locate the experience of that kind of absence in the body, we might point towards the abdomen, sort of not having a birth swelling, or perhaps the vagina, through which sperm would be introduced for conception. While the remedy here does involve the vagina, attention within it is directed towards the mouth, through which the odor of the object placed in the vagina is meant to be perceived. In order for such a directive to make sense, it has to be understood there's a connection existing within the body between the vagina and the mouth. So that's a link that's implicitly theorized by the remedy, and it's expressing a conceptualization of something that's hidden within the female body. So this might kind of seem like something very obvious to draw attention to, but I think what's important to recognize here is what the implication is of this structuring of knowledge. So rather than proceeding from what the person experiencing non-pregnancy has before them, as it were, or not before them, the individual has to accept the epistemological authority of this theory, in order for this to make sense over and above the sort of direct experience. So whoever the you is in this remedy, and it's quite clear here that it's not the woman herself, they have a relatively greater power in the encounter as the one who's administering this remedy that's based on that theory. So let's talk a little bit about the identity of that you. This specific papyrus doesn't articulate who they might be, but we do find it famously expressed in the Ebers papyrus, so where it is stated that the following passages after this point are, quote, the beginning of the secret of the physician, end quote. And in the very next passage, that knowledge is also extended to the Wab priest of Sekhmet and the Sa'u, and that's generally translated as magician. Indeed, in some inscriptions, and we've actually talked about this fella already, this fellow Harry Shefnat, whose graffito is found in the quarry of Hatnab. He is labeled as being chief of the Sunu of the king, but also overseer of the priests of Sekhmet, and also overseer of the magicians. So he's really demonstrating what Rita talked about at the beginning of this idea of dual competence. So on the surface, at least, the approach of the magical medical papyri would seem to kind of match with modern medical dynamics, in which the framing of patient experience is dictated by the physician who represents an expert, who is cordoned off by their title of physician from the rest of the population. There are a few more titles involved, but it seems very similar in many ways. But as we go a bit more into things, the picture becomes a bit more complicated. So many of the inscriptions that mention physicians or other kind of practitioners list that competency alongside other kinds of roles that they performed. So for instance, this is Pentu from Tel El Amarna, who was in his tomb described as chief physician, but also first priest of Aten, and also royal chancellor, among other roles, highlighting that the identity of Sunu could be not exclusive. It might be just one part of somebody's identity, a kind of part-time gig, you might think. And this is also something that we see in those individuals that are labeled as Sunu at Deir el-Medina. They are also members of the workforce, so they are participating in creating the tombs at the same time as supplying a certain amount of expertise to their fellow workmen. In addition, while the remedy that I've shown you here sort of emphasizes that recourse to a hidden theoretical world of the body, there are other remedies that keep treatments a little closer to that side of experience. So, for instance, case 7 of the Kahun gynecological papyrus, where there is aching in the calves and legs. This is labeled as discharges of the uterus, which might seem to draw us away from that side of experience of the symptoms. It's still then brought back and treated by massaging the legs and calves with mud, so we are not drawn away entirely. Okay, so while the boundaries of authority that are exerted in this text are therefore kind of a bit blurred, it's important then to look at what theories those experts are putting forwards and what that tells us about the construction of the body. As noted in modern medicine, a particularly disabling aspect is this idea of functional determinism. My question is whether we see this at all in the papyri. So let's go back to that same remedy that we've already looked at from Papyrus Carlsberg. As I've said, the treatment implies this theory of a connection between the mouth and the vagina. So a reconstruction of the Egyptian physiology of the female body must include some sort of transect that it clearly has to remain clear in order for pregnancy to occur. The next thing is to establish why this feature is there and what that might mean for thinking about fertility. To me, at least, when I first read this, this idea of a link between mouth and vagina almost inevitably brought to mind the image of the sky goddess Nut swallowing the sun, which this is an example from the ceiling of the tomb of Ramses V and VI in the Valley of the King. So the story goes, of course, that Nut swallows the sun every evening, and then he passes through her body and she gives birth to him again each morning. So the question is, what would it mean if the structuring of the female body within these medical texts derived from that sort of cultural idea? And one possibility is that because of this cosmic role of Nut, the appearance of what would seem to be an analogous channel in female anatomy might indicate a sort of symbolic purpose. Since we might think that the sun being swallowed in the evening, in a sense, kind of dies, only to be born again each morning, that channel kind of provides a link between death and life. And therefore, symbolically, magically, we might think about the necessity of there being this channel in order for birth to take place in the female body. It's a very intriguing possibility that does create an idea of purpose behind that, that structuring. But something we have to bear in mind is there's no sort of confirmation of that connection to be found in the papyri themselves. There's nothing helpful like an incantation that evokes Nut in this kind of circumstance, which would be super helpful. There is a reference to servants of Nut in one of the Ramesseum papyri, but that's in relation to the childhood illness of Ba instead, so the connection is not quite secure. An alternative way, however, of understanding this connection can be found in the papyri themselves, and that's through the system of the metu. So I'm following in the footsteps of Tanya Pomerenging and Reinhard Skavnes in drawing attention to this possibility. So in the Ebers papyrus in particular, you have this very detailed description of the system of the metu, which we often translate as vessels, but is probably something a bit more encompassing of different string-like features in the body. So as Ebers says, and also Mena, you pointed out yesterday too, so that was very helpful, the metu form a network that goes through the whole body. So quote, all the vessels go to the heart, they divide to his nodes, and all unite at his buttocks. Pains of the rear come about through them. It is excretion that leads to its coming. End quote. So discussions of how the metu system works do not explicitly include female anatomical parts into that system, but they do incorporate male genitalia, explaining that it's through the metu system that semen is delivered to the penis. In this case, if this is what's going on with this link between the mouth and the vagina, that it is a sort of species of this general system of the metu, we can say that that connection, its existence, and its importance for being clear doesn't seem to reflect a specific purpose, or indeed we might say that there doesn't seem to be a specific purpose to the metu system overall. So in this quote we see this reference to pains of the rear and excretions, and this seems to be the metu seems to be the way that sort of thing is moved around the body. There's also references to other substances such as air, water, and as I've mentioned, semen moving through them. But what we find in the papyri is presented more as a description of fact, of things that happen, rather than a statement of a goal that is supposed to achieve specifically. So in the internal discourses of the magical medical papyri, the metu explanation seems to be the one that's sort of best attested, and that is therefore a non-goal-oriented way of understanding these features of the female body. But there is still that cultural backdrop of Nut and this world of myth that does get evoked so frequently in the papyri. And what we might imagine is that depending on which explanation you want to go with, it might depend on the individual medical encounter with a patient. Both are available to be looked to. Okay, at this point I'm going to very swiftly pivot to looking at some of the other approaches to healing in the context of infertility that we can find. There's so much more I could talk about the geography of the body, but we don't have time for it. More for Q&A. We'll come back to it. Okay. So one of the routes that Egyptians might use to tackle the question of infertility would be to appeal to the dead. So I'm going to bring up one of these letters to the dead, which was written on a jar stand, and it says, quote, "Now let a healthy male child be born to me, because you are an excellent spirit," end quote. And I don't want to go into this too much in the interest of time, but something I would like to pull out is that the focus here is very much on the desired result, the child, and not on the specifics of how that might be achieved within anybody's body as such. It's through the agency of the dead, but not necessarily focused on anything going on in the body. You could say the same for this votive offering of a female figurine carrying a child. On the legs there is an inscription which reads, quote, "An offering which the king gives for the car of Khonsu, a birth for Tita," end quote. Again, a birth, the sort of end result of this prayer, is what is at the focus, and the means by which that achieved, aside from sort of the power of the god, does not appear. There's nothing here about intervention in the body, for instance. There are some rare instances of anatomical votives that have been offered, such as these genitalia from the Chapel of Hathor at Deir al-Bahri. It's worth noting that anatomical votives in general, most often we see ears and eyes. They have often been interpreted as being the organs of the gods themselves, so that they're offered to encourage the divinity to listen to the prayers of the one offering them, or to see what their particular needs are. So it's possible that in offering genitalia as well, there's a very different thing going on. But if these are related to childbirth, something I think that's notable is that they are external body parts, not a representation of a uterus or anything like that. We are focusing here, I would argue, on the site of experience. It's worth noting, however, that particularly for the full figure figurines, the ones that are connected with childbearing always do seem to be women, and in other modes of addressing this too, we do see a gender skew in the way of approaching infertility, so that seems to remain present. Okay, aware again of time, I'm just going to conclude really quickly. The magico-medical papyri seem to show a clear trend towards emphasizing expertise and skewing the power towards expert practitioners and away from patients, but the boundaries of that are a little blurred, and it is not as much of a closed system as certainly as we see in modern settings. The construct of the body that's put forward within this discourse, moreover, leans within the papyri at least towards a sort of descriptive presentation of cause and effect, but can be read within a wider cultural setting, potentially with more of a restrictive interpretation of how the body should work. But that is something that would come out in that oral encounter between patient and practitioner. Outside of that discourse, meanwhile, I'm forgetting to press forward on my slides, sorry. There seems to be a sort of results-focused approach that predominates rather than deconstructing the workings of the body, even though at the same time there is a sort of gendered aspect that is preserved within the way that it works. So it seems like there's little doubt that we can definitely say that there is a gendered aspect to the approach to infertility in ancient Egypt. But what I hope to have shown is that the power dynamics in that healing encounter and the construction of the body that are presented left a lot of room for negotiating what that might mean in an individual context. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was actually really interesting. I had no idea that infertility was viewed as a disability. Already past the time, and we are essentially in the phase of discussion. So, yes, we could start with questions. relevant to your talk.
Thank you for this paper. I have some comments, and I don't mean to blow my own horn, but a couple of years ago, I published a re-edition of P. Carlsberg 8, and I discussed many of the things that you discussed today, so I think it would be useful for you to have a look at.
Yeah.
One of these things is the conceptualization of the female body and this passageway from vagina to mouth, where the anus also seems to be connected somehow.
Yes.
And the connection you make tentatively to Nude, a Norwegian colleague, Reinhard Skumsnes. I don't know if you're aware of his publication.
Yes, I have.
And I also just wanted to note that in this publication, I also discuss kind of the social implications of infertility, as you did as well a little bit, and what it would have meant for the women who were, it seems, essentially identified as infertile for life, right? But also note that there were, of course, measures to kind of not counteract this, but if we look, for instance, at the adoption papyrus, we see that they had different measures in place to kind of deal with this sort of issue.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that, and I know what you're talking about. But yes, your own publication is something that I have yet to look at, but I will do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for this very fascinating presentation. I really like it so much. And I was going actually to comment on the same part that Sophia had just made a comment about, which is the connection between the mouth and vagina of Nude. Right now, I mean, like currently, I'm also doing some kind of research about this kind of connection. And I assume that what the papyri, like the medical papyri, is actually and this image of the connection between these two is not, we should not look at them as separate images, but I think that they are two ideas, two faces of the same coin. Because if you, for example, going to examine some scenes from like kind of daily life, like for example one of the scenes on the very famous representations of giving birth that is found on what we call in the Abydos birth brick. You find some kind of imagery that are related to the solar cycle that relates the woman actually to Nude.
Okay.
So I think that this connection is deeply rooted in the Egyptian mind.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it has something to do that it does not came from religion to the medical papyri, but it's actually, they have the same idea, but it's represented in both cases, in the daily life, like in medically reflected, and also reflected in the afterlife conceptions.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sharing my thoughts with you because I told you, I'm telling you that I'm currently doing actually writing and kind of a paper about this because my PhD was about the conception of the doors of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And like the heaven is actually the female, and her body parts is actually the doors and all the stages.
Yeah,
so that's one of the points that I used to argue, that it's not just a cosmological or a religious idea, but it's rather a real idea that the female is actually, this is something also, I don't want to take all the time, but it's something, it's a psychological concept, which is the Great Mother, and the Great Mother it's kind of a vessel, and this vessel is actually like the Mother Earth that we go to and from. It's kind of a cycle. So I think it's something in the human psychology, kind of.
Yeah, no, totally, absolutely. And when in saying like that it's not rooted in something that we have extant in the papyri, it is not at all to kind of discount that as something that could very well be mobilized and may well have existed somewhere else, and not to differentiate these two zones or anything like that. Rather, I wanted to draw attention to the idea that there's something that's written into the discourse of the papyri, and there is something that's there that's implicit that can be kind of, would have probably been drawn out in individual encounters, but in that oral zone is where negotiation of the meaning of this situation might be found. Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'm going to be real quick, but I got a problem with this spell since a lot. They know exact term for vagina. They have really shadat, indicating something that is a cavity. They have cat for vulva. They have you for meat and flesh. They use it also for men in the same corpus. And I mean, if you insert a tuberous for a one night in a vagina, I think the day after you don't check the mouth. You just want to check that you're not dying for septicemia.
Well, that might well be what you would imagine, but it's directing you towards the mouth for a reason, because there is this idea.
But I mean, I think youth is not correctly translated with vagina. I'm sorry, but there is the same corpus with the term for vagina, and why in this spell is always translated with vagina when you have shadat, you have a cat, and yeah, maybe if you have any ideas.
Clara's done stuff on this.
Like for my PhD, I am trying to because maybe you think different than me, but I am trying to solve this problem because there are different terms for the female genitalia, but the point is that technically they have been always translated as vagina in general or womb in general without thinking of the context, because it's not the same if you anoint something in youth or if you pour something that means that it's a vagina. So normally cat should be vagina, because also in literature, in the Two Brothers' Tale, there's the cat an adjective, I cannot remember, that is like a vagina, crazy vagina or something like that. Yeah, in the two tales, in the Tale of Two Brothers, when she shows, and there's like a term that is cat and an adjective that Marco Oriols has said that it's vagina, but when you understand this terminology within the remedies, you see that the verbs of the application of the treatment is different. So youth, from our perspective, would be more like the vulva or the flesh, and cat is only vagina. But it's not because youth would be like something with the mouth or anything like that. It's because they thought that everything was connected and related to nude, and also, for example, from the female genitalia, pehut, it's also connected. So I think that we should not search for what we think it is logical, but what they say, and also like not isolating only the terms, but seeing like the context, and also comparing with all the papyrus. So I think that youth normally is vulva, and will be the phraseology, like the collocation, normally is into, because it's with M. Okay, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that there's not just the single one that talks about there being some sort of connection between these two. It appears and is implied in other remedies as well. This is the one that I chose to use for this particular presentation, but there are others that imply that same connection. So I think I don't definitely understand what you're saying about the difficulty of terminology. I think to some extent there's interpretation going on here that is to do with what we can see across the different remedies for thinking about female physiology, and therefore that it would make sense to reconstruct an M here and have this being inserted. But I take your point, and I know what you mean. It's something that I'm discussing in the sort of broader text of this. but yeah, wasn't something to look into in detail right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine. Just a short comment. Maybe you already know, but I think the ancient Greeks have had the same idea of a direct link between the mouth and the vagina. I'm thinking about a belief that some animals, like the weasel, will give birth through the mouth.
Yes, yeah, that's true. This is, as I said, my broader dissertation is as a comparative work. But one of the things that I'm really keen to do, because another reason why this has been translated the way it has, is that a lot of people who've worked on this have read the medical texts from Greece, have used that to inform the way that they reconstruct it. I still agree, broadly speaking, with that one, particularly because of what's in the papyri rather than what's in the Greek texts. But one of the things I'm hoping to show is that there's a very different logic behind this connection in the different ones. So within the Hippocratic corpus, this connection between mouth and vagina is to do with a system, similarly a system of what are called phlebes, but they are to do with the porosity and moisture that's in a female body as opposed to a male. So it's all about distinguishing men from women, whereas potentially here we might rather see it as part of a general system. There's also a whole question around whether or not the womb moves around inside the body in Egypt, and whether or not that's something that people have kind of imported in to explain things in the Egyptian papyri, but is in fact not really present there, which on the whole I would say it's not, or if it's there, it's motivated by something very different. But yeah.
I have a question and another comment, please. Thank you very much for this interesting paper. First of all, I want to know whether it is perceived as a disability for all the social classes or for specific classes, because for the royals, I think this is not a great problem, because he could marry another person and have concubines and have children. This is not a great deal.
Yeah.
I have another comment, please. You said that you stressed on specific part of the body, which is the genital and the mouth, and giving like note in this example. There are another methods for females, I think, especially goddesses like Iuseas, she uses her hand, not only her vagina or even her mouth, I think so.
You're talking about the different modes of conception that appear in mythology? You mean?
In mythology, I know it is represented. It is not. It is represented in Abu Simbel. Indeed, Iuseas. She is the hand of the god.
Yes, yes. Yeah. A reference, though, I think, to the myth about Atum creating the first gods by sort of masturbating, and that comes to have a sort of female personification. Absolutely. There are a number of different sort of like ideas about how conception works in Egypt, but within the medical papyri, at least, like when we're talking about human women, it's largely focusing on thinking about vaginal conception, shall we say. But sorry, would you repeat your question again? Oh, about different modes?
The perception of
the perception of it. Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that I'm also trying to look at is whether or not within the papyri themselves there's a sort of implied demographic of people that this is particularly pertinent towards through. Just trying to think about that kind of demographic. And you're certainly true. I would say that my project is not overall to determine whether or not infertility is a disability in society at large, which would involve, as you say, taking in a lot of different evidence to think about this very broadly in society, but rather simply to look at the medical and healing discourse and think about how that works there, just to keep it a little bit limited. But I think you're quite right. I mean, really, it definitely makes a great deal of difference what echelon of society you would be in as to what that really means for you in your life. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we'll let Jasmine go. She did brilliantly answering all those questions. But before she goes, my personal reflection, I think if there was an award for the best engaged or most engaged participant of this conference, the award would go to you, because you had a question, I think, for every single presentation, which is amazing to see. I mean, I'm not saying that you lot were not engaged. I think it was generally very, very well sort of, engaged, conference. Everybody was just kind of having different questions and reflections, which is brilliant, but you did amazingly, so thank you very much. Right, so we still have, I think, around 10 minutes that we might use for additional questions. If anything comes to mind about the day one talks, today's talks, anything, I could see a hand over there.
I would like to thank you all for your researches about it's a part of saving and safeguarding our Egyptian heritage. So thank you from all Egyptian scholars for our colleagues here. I have 3 notes. First, I think in the future we have to give more attention to Bir Ankh, House of Life. It's the first school of medicine. So I guess maybe in the future we have to give more attention about it, because I think I didn't attend yesterday, so I don't know if any school, if any colleagues spoke about Bir Ankh. It was like a scriptorium in the medieval. Second point, we have to differentiate between 2 terms, healer and physician. It's whiteboarding, so everybody is using healer and physician. Third point, I would like to discuss with you about, is there any evidence about local workshop about medicine? So is there any reference of local workshops producing medicine in ancient Egypt or not? Thank you.
Well, generally, I think we kind of agree that there's a lot that can be explored. We only have had 2 days. That is not enough. I'm not complaining about my 45 minutes, by the way. Someone said I should have talked for 2 hours. I don't think so. But yes, it was my pleasure, if I may just say a few words from my side, because I was kind of one of the minority here, bioarchaeologists stepping into the world of healing medicine and medical text or medical magical papyri. And I was really looking forward to this conference, because I really wanted to know what has been written and to kind of see how texts are interpreted, how much. I know we can learn a lot, but more specifically, can bioarchaeological evidence actually be kind of, not maybe matched, but compared, and sort of can we together collaboratively work to actually enhance what we know so far from 2 different subdisciplines and sources. So there have been very fruitful, I think, very inspiring presentations, discussions, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I hope you have as well. So hopefully, we can have more, conferences where different disciplines come together and sort of inspire one another. I think that would be lovely. So that's from me, and I thank you all for coming, and I'll pass the microphone now to Gabriele, who will have some final remarks. Thank you.
No, thank you. And well, it's just continuing from what you were saying, because and the purpose of the conference was exactly this. Because as I said in the first day, the topic of medicine in Egypt is something that, it's really long-standing. It's something that was born almost a few years after the birth of Egyptology itself. So from one point of view, one might ask what is left to say about ancient Egyptian medicine. But I think that in these 2 days we realized that there is a lot to say still. And this is especially because it is a matter of maybe changing perspectives and introducing new perspectives, new methods on what has been already said until now. So moving from, as I said other times, a purely biomedical approach, not because it was wrong, of course, but because there are a set of dynamics, processes, phenomena that when you address texts, materials, and also the bodies just with the purpose of finding diseases and finding remedies, everything else remains in the background or also invisible. And I think that in these 2 days we saw that also trying to apply concepts from other disciplines, which apparently maybe they are difficult to apply to ancient Egypt, or for example all the social frameworks that we saw in the last part of this day. They can tell us something more. They can help us to find new ways to address the text, the materiality, the body themselves. So this was the real purpose of this conference, and I'm really happy that to have heard a lot of different presentation with different methods, with different backgrounds. I think that it really helped moving forward in this topic. Please.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture and conference and the interesting topic, but I have just a brief question. Do you know the topic of the next conference? And when will be the deadline for the abstracts? I am looking forward for.
I don't know because as long as I remain the fellow from this program, I think that there will no another conference. So we have to wait till I finished, and then there will be another another call and another conference. So it's just a matter of time.
No, I simply want to spend a word for Gabriele, because I really saw his development from his research from Pisa, because he started in Pisa. He already held a small conference in Pisa on the subject, and which now will be published. I think at the end of the year there will be a small volume on the health, published by Brepos and edited by Gabriele and I, on well-being in ancient Egypt. So it's exactly the same subject. And I see how Gabriele slowly, he transformed a personal subject into a more dynamic network as today, and moved the idea of health from individuals to the social context, the social medicine. And I'm happy that you gathered so many people. Also, you gathered an audience around the subject, and you are trying to move the subject into another dimension rather than staying in individual subjects. So I would really like to thank you for all that you have done for this.
Thank you very much. And well, I think that we still have time for some more comments, or if someone has some questions that he left for another moment, we can just have now. Otherwise, yes. Otherwise, outside there is. Oh, yeah.
From a complete outsider's perspective, because I'm not an Egyptologist, as I've said many times, it was very interesting to see how people, because I often see it as very narrow in subject and doesn't really engage with wider debates and things like that, perhaps wrongly, but here changed my mind. So my question would be, can you tell us a little bit about how you're envisaging the proceedings, how you're going to push that forward? Because you have an opportunity here to make something substantive from it that people like myself will engage with, rather than just an Egyptological audience, as important as that might be. So I wondered if you could say a few things about that.
Yeah. The proceedings are Okay. Proceedings are definitely the first step from this conference, and both because it is a part of the fellowship, and also because I really think that all that has been said, all that has been shown in these 2 days needs to be gathered in some more substantial, also to try to create something new to be to move forward the study of Egyptian medicine, and I think that the proceeding of this conference will be very useful tools and instruments for everyone who wants to delve in the topic in the future. So yes, it would be this is definitely the next step, and we'll let you know in the next weeks. Yeah, I will let you know in the next days. I think that there is a timeline on the website, and right now I don't remember the date, but I have a deadline by which I will send you the guidelines, and then together the papers. Yeah, it would be great. Yeah, it would be great. Yeah, it's a matter of look for them. Okay. Okay, so. Well, I think it's still a bit early, but I think we can go in the garden, and there will be again the cocktail party as yesterday. So please join us in the garden of the fall. Oh yes, yes, of course, and thank you very much also from the people which were following us online. Thank you very much again to everyone.